right, I hope you had a good lunch. I hope you met a new friend. I hope you reconnected maybe with an old friend. Okay. So we're going to talk about agriculture this afternoon. I've become very frustrated at water conferences when the subject turns to agriculture because the framing always bothers me. And I'm reminded, this is going to be a bit of a weird tangent. I'm reminded of the bank robber from the 1920s and 30s, Willie Sutton, when they asked him why he robs banks, and he says, because that's where the money is. And the questioner was trying to, presumably, not that I was there, but the questioner was presumably trying to get to the moral question of why he would rob banks. And Willie Sutton instead went for the very pragmatic answer of that's where the money is. And that sort of pragmatism is what has inspired me in the framing of this agricultural discussion, and that, I've lost patience for presentations that are simply, ag uses all the water, therefore ag is evil, those sort of ones. And the other ones are you like to eat, don't you? So, don't even look at agriculture. I look at it in a much more pragmatic way, inspired by Willie Sutton, and that is just looking at the numbers. And the numbers say that we're going to have to use a lot less water in this basin in the future. And if we're going to have to use less water in the future, then we need to talk about agriculture and the future of agriculture, because that's where most of the water is used. And so let's have a smart, pragmatic conversation about that and see if we can't identify some smart, pragmatic solutions that work for everybody. So that's kind of my Pollyanna approach here. And so with that, I think we have some pragmatic speakers lined up today. We're going to start with, we have 5 very different speakers, and I'll just head you off right now and say I acknowledge that, these are 5 little slices of a huge pie, and so there's all sorts of issues and perspectives we're not going to get to, but we're going to get to what we can get to. We're going to start with Brian Richter, because I think he's got the most global perspective of our group. And I know Brian will stick to the numbers heavily, because that's what he does. Brian's been working on issues of water sustainability for at least 30 years, most recently as president of Sustainable Waters. He does research and consulting all over the world, which again, I think is really helpful, as the challenges we're facing in the Colorado River Basin, many of them really aren't that different than what you'll see elsewhere in the world. So that's my, again, keeping in my tradition of brief intros. If you want more information, follow the link in the program. But Brian, you got everything you need?
Great, Doug, and I just want to say thank you for the invitation, and it's a great honor for me personally to be able to address this crowd. And I want to start off in taking this moment. This is the first time I've been invited to join this party, and it may very likely be my last. Not because of what I'm about to say, but I'm coming into that point in my career. But I just wanted to say a thank you to all of you in the room for the many, many years of tireless work and passion that you've put into trying to save this river that nourishes all of us. And I mean that by both humans and the other creatures that we share this river basin with. And so thank you for that. Brad, I'm also going to single you out here, bud. Scientist to scientist. I think so highly of your research and the work that you do. It's outstanding and it's highly relevant, but I want to thank you for communicating it in forums like this. And you don't hold punches, you speak truth to power or to people who may not want to hear what you have to say. And so thank you for that, Brad. Yeah. Okay, so I do have a little bit of an odd title here. Thanks, Doug. And I'm thinking about Patty Limerick's comment about the cage. She talked about the cage and getting put into a cage, and this cage feels a little tight to me. And so I'm going to just, and don't worry, Doug, he's getting nervous already. I'm going to just expand the boundaries of this cage a little bit, because I think before I dive into the ag water numbers, it's important to put those numbers into the broader context of what's going on in the Colorado River Basin and talk about the larger water budget. As my mentor and peer, David Harrison, once implored me, he said, "It's the water budget, stupid." And I've kept that in mind, David, through all of these decades, and it has guided much of my work. So thank you for that. Okay, so let's, what I want to do, so I'm going to share with you some very, very recent work. We're about to publish this in collaboration with some really, really wonderful scientists. It's a global paper, but we're looking at a number of different case studies in the Western United States. And one part of it is, basically what the paper is about is to think about water sustainability. Now, I'm just talking about the physical aspects, the hydrological aspects of sustainability, to think about it as in the context of both what's going on the surface, how are river outflows, in different river basins, how have they changed? What are the trends there? What's going on with reservoir storage, the stocks of water that are within the system? And then also bringing in, and I'm going to say a lot more about this in a moment, bringing in the underground water, the groundwater aquifers, and how groundwater is changing over time as well. And so this is a data set that we've been working very, very hard to compile for a lot of different places. What you're seeing here is the compilation, and thanks to Jack Schmidt, by the way, who I know is not here, but a lot of this reservoir data came from Jack's databases. He's always been very generous with sharing those data with anybody. But we embellished it, and we added a lot more reservoirs and went to state agencies that manage the reservoirs. We went to irrigation districts that manage reservoirs. And this is a compilation of water supply reservoirs, 51 different reservoirs across the basin. Now, what you see here is, the projection of, or I should say the trend of something on the order of a little over 700,000 acre feet per year of depletion in the reservoir storage, okay? Now, I mentioned just a moment ago about how I also feel it's very, very important that we start to take a much more holistic look at water supply and water management and water accounting and water sustainability. And instead of just looking at the Colorado River, and everybody thinks that means water on the surface, to also be thinking about the Colorado River Basin as the water that's underground and what's going on there. And so there's a couple of terrific scientists at Arizona State University, led by Jay Famiglietti. A lot of you know him, and his pioneering work on using satellite data to be able to map changes in water volumes and in particular in groundwater volumes. And this is work that a lot of you probably saw in the last couple of weeks. It's getting a lot of good media attention, thankfully. And you see here, I've put the annual average trend out of their paper here, about 1.2 million acre feet per year of loss underground. So a punchline in their paper is we're losing about 2.5 times as much water underground in the Colorado River Basin as we've been losing on the surface. Another thing I wanted to point out here is you see that they've got two trend lines here. The trends in the last 10 years are about 3 times steeper of downward decline in groundwater than they were in the initial period of record here. By the way, the periods of record that I've been working with on all of these slides, I should have said this earlier, 2000 through 2024 on all of these. Now, why do I feel so strongly that looking at groundwater is important? Well, one, there's a couple of different reasons. One, many of the water users in the Colorado River Basin are using both sources of water, both surface and groundwater. Two, much of the groundwater pumped in the Colorado River Basin is actually capturing Colorado River water. It's definitely more than a third. We don't really have a really good, I think, accurate estimate of that yet, but it's more than a third of the water that we pump from groundwater wells in the Colorado River Basin is sucking water out of the Colorado River. So that's two. The third is that even if they're not physically connected, they're connected from a socioeconomic and a management standpoint. What I mean by that is in times when surface water supplies are short, what we've seen all around the world is that water users will turn to pumping groundwater more heavily. And I think that explains a lot about the change in trend here in the last 10 years as surface water supplies have been depleted heavily within the Colorado River Basin. We've seen an uptick or a downward steepening of the trend in groundwater depletion. So again, these are very, very early numbers that we hope to publish very, very soon, Colorado River Basin being one. But the idea is to take these different stocks and flows of water and integrate them to give you a better, more robust, and I think more representative or more informative picture of what's going on with the water and the sustainability of water use within a system like the Colorado River. So I'm going to get to this part about where this number came from in just a minute. But the direct consumptive use, groundwater and surface water, is at least 15 million acre feet per year. That's the direct use. That's for municipal, commercial, industrial, agricultural use. Around 15 million acre feet per year. Again, the change in reservoir storage that I just shared with you a moment ago, a little over 700,000 acre feet, change in ground and aquifer storage across the 25-year period. The average was about 1.2 million acre feet per year. That sums up to just about 2 million acre feet per year of depletion of water from the Colorado River Basin, okay? Primarily surface water reservoir storage plus the groundwater. If you do the math on that, the simple math suggests then that the gap that Ann Castle referred to earlier, the gap is at least 13 to 15%, meaning our overconsumption. If you look at the portion of our consumption of water in the Colorado River Basin, as measured against this depletion of storage, it looks like about 13 to 15% of overdraft that's taking place. Now, if you changed and you paid more attention to that last 10 years instead of the last 25 years, that number would soar up to about 24% of overdraft in the Colorado River Basin. So I wanted to put these numbers out there. We're still working on them. Don't go to press with them. We still need to tighten up the numbers and make sure they're right. But this gives you some sense of the context of water use, water consumption in the Colorado River Basin. Okay, now to the topic that Doug has asked me to talk about. This is a paper that a lot of you saw. Probably not many of you read it, but you probably saw a lot of the derivative media coverage on it. You know, I've been working as a scientist and working on the Colorado River and other places for, I guess, 35, going on 40 years now. Written a bunch of papers, bunch of crap. And I never had this experience of having a journal paper go viral. And this paper got so much media coverage that just 1 year later, it's in the top 1% of all the hundreds of thousands of journal papers that have been published in the recent decades in terms of the media attention that it got. So thanks to all of you for the ruckus you've created about the Colorado River. I guess people are pretty interested in this topic, and that was kind of a big surprise to our group. Now, I want to say something about our motivations for doing this. So it turns out I kind of chuckled. The couple of important things that I think I've done in my career have come out of a deep sense of personal frustration. It was like, why hasn't somebody done this before? I don't really want to do this, but nobody else has done it before, so darn it, somebody's got to do it. So that was the case here. And so there were two really, really important things or aspects of my frustration. One was how we talk about the Colorado River Basin. With apologies to all the attorneys in the room, the Colorado River isn't defined by what you call the upper and the lower basin. There's also this big part of the basin, 25% of the land area, is called the Gila River Basin. And then there's also, of course, the Mexico portion. So I was very frustrated that nobody had put together a water budget for the entirety of the geographic river basin before. Like I said, I really didn't want to have to do it, but we ended up spending a couple of years pulling those numbers together. The other thing that got to be very frustrating to me was it became common language to say things like nearly 80% of the Colorado River goes to irrigated agriculture. It's not true. You haven't been looking at where all the water goes. It's only about half of the water, of the Colorado River's water that goes to irrigated ag, because we haven't been paying sufficient attention to things like the reservoir evaporation, a little more than 10%, to the essential riparian vegetation that lines the tributaries and the main stem of the Colorado River. As a nature boy, it was very important to me to be able to get that nature part into the water budget. Turns out it's almost 20%, as you can see there. So I really thought it was important to change our language and to at least be more accurate about saying where the Colorado River's water goes. And I hope that a lot of you will take our efforts to heart in that respect. Before I dive into the ag and start to parse that out, Doug, I also wanted to say something about this piece. So the ag water consumption is 3 times greater than all of the other water that's being used for municipal, commercial, and industrial use. Those 2 pieces of the pie, the MCI and the agriculture, I'll refer to as direct consumption from here on out. What's interesting, not just that agriculture is 3 times more than the MCI water, but I think it's also important to understand that the cities that are dependent upon the Colorado River's water have been doing some pretty miraculous work over the last couple of decades in reducing their water use. Those cities on average, we talk about 40 million people dependent upon the Colorado River's water. On average, the populations dependent on the river have grown by 24% over the recent decades, and their water use has dropped by 18%. So I think that's some congratulations to Bill Hassenkamp and all the others that have been working for municipal water use. Pretty phenomenal that not only your population growing by 24%, and you didn't just keep it stable, but you actually dropped it by 18%. So that's an important part of the history here, of the recent history to understand. Okay, so now some of the pie charts, and we'll start to get into parsing out a little bit more about where the water really goes. I showed you this one just a moment ago. This is where all the water goes. And again, matter of language matters. If you talk about all consumption, this is where the river goes. This is how water gets used for direct human consumption. So that municipal, commercial, and industrial plus the agriculture, that's the direct use. And then of course the percentages change when you're just looking at the direct human uses. 3/4 going to ag. And this is why, by the way, the media and a lot of other folks have been saying nearly 80% of the river goes to, well, it's nearly 80% of the water directly consumed for human purposes. It's 75% is a little bit more of a refined number, I think. And about 1/4 of it going to that MCI use there. Then we took that agricultural part and split it apart. We did a very, very detailed analysis on how much water each individual crop was using in each part of the Colorado River Basin. And we looked at this over 20 years, essentially, 2000 to 2020. And you can see the splits there. So, alfalfa specifically is about 50% of the agricultural water use. Other grass hays is about 12%. So I'm going to start referring to these as cattle feed crops. Cattle feed crops, about 62%. So not quite 2/3 of the direct use of the Colorado River. Wheat and cotton are also important. Other crops, 12% there. We can break this down into any of the subbasins. So if you look at just the lower Colorado River Basin, it's really interesting. The changes in the numbers in the lower Colorado River Basin look quite similar to what they do for the entire basin. It's no surprise. The majority of the water is being consumed within the lower Colorado River Basin. That's no secret to anybody in this room. So the numbers are fairly close, even with reservoir evaporation and riparian vegetation. And again, similar on the direct use, and also not that far different in terms of the crop pie over there So you can see the numbers there for the water that's being used among the various crops. The other crops really pops up though when you look at just lower Colorado because of the diversity of crop production within the lower Colorado River Basin, places like Imperial and Yuma, in the Yuma districts and all. Quite a bit more diversity in other crops. And each of them individually doesn't add up to much, but collectively, it's a good share of the agricultural water pie. Lastly, I'll show you the numbers for the upper Colorado River Basin here. And the numbers look quite a bit different in the upper basin. The riparian vegetation portions and the reservoir evaporation are greater on a percentage basis, but that's entirely explained by the fact that you're dealing with a smaller pie to begin with. So the numbers, the rates, it's not that like they have a lot more riparian vegetation consuming water in the upper basin. It's just a matter of the total water consumption within the upper basin is smaller, and therefore each of these pieces, reservoir evaporation goes up to 15%, riparian vegetation up to 24%. And then you see the ag is 48%. When you look at the direct consumption, the ag is more heavily weighted in the upper basin, 78% as compared to 22% for the municipal, commercial, and industrial. And this is, I think, one of the more fascinating to a lot of people who live in the upper basin. It's no surprise. The consumption of water within agriculture for what we were calling cattle feed crops is a whopping 90% of all of the ag water consumption in the upper basin. That's pretty phenomenal. And there's all kinds of reasons behind that that we can get into later. But that's how it breaks out in the upper basin, a bit different. So let me, because cattle feed crops, and a little reflection here. I've been called by the ranching community the assassin of cattle ranching in the Southwest. And I want to be clear that I have no problem with people eating beef and dairy products. And in fact, much of the recent increases in water consumption for cattle feed crops is because of our yogurt and cheese. It's not because of beef consumption. Beef consumption has stayed pretty flat. So, and I also hear too often my friends and colleagues will say things like, can you believe that, they're using all that water to feed cows? It's not even going to feed people. And it's like, really? You're not eating beef or dairy products, right? So just wanted to be like full transparency here. This is I'm just playing the scientist as Brad did with climate. I'm just trying to share you the numbers as best we know them, okay? No judgment. All right, so in the overall basin, cattle feed crops, 46% of all of our direct water use. That includes all the cities, and it's 62% of ag. Here's the differences between the different subbasins. 70% of all direct water in the upper basin, and I mentioned 90% of ag water. Lower basin, there you see the numbers, 41% of all the direct water, 57%. In the Gila, 33% of all the direct water consumption in the Gila is going to these cattle feed crops, a little more than half of the ag water. And in Mexico, I thought it was, again, I'll say it again, it was really important to understand how water is being used through the entirety of the geographic Colorado River Basin. And so we also had some contributors on this paper that brought together some really, really important numbers to help us understand how water gets used south of the international border. 21% of all the water in Mexico, Colorado River water, is being used for these cattle feed crops. So I'm going to conclude on this. I promised Doug was very careful in managing the topics, and I appreciate that a great deal. And he said he did not want me clearly to talk about the economics of any of this, and didn't really want me to go into some of the strategies or what the implications of these numbers are. In other words, scientists, stick to your science. But I did want to mention that we just did a similar analysis for the Great Salt Lake Basin that came out just at the end of last year. And we did that. We went into the economics of the agricultural production and the other uses, and we explored 4 different scenarios of how they could save the Great Salt Lake. It's a smaller issue. The water crisis in the Great Salt Lake is a crisis, but not the size of the Colorado River Basin. It's about 1/3 to 1/4 of the water of the Colorado River Basin. But I think I wanted to just show you this because it might be of interest to some of you, because we did get into the economics. We did get into some of the possible strategies of how do you rebalance things to bring you back into consumption being more in balance with the replenishment of the system. So I'm going to stop there, and thanks, Doug.
All right. That's just what I was looking for. Let's just get some numbers out there. We are going to transition in the next couple talks here to talk a lot about the economics. So we will get there. And, all right. Next up is Peter Culp. When I first asked Peter to speak at the event, I wasn't very clear at all about what I wanted him to talk about. So he got a different experience than you got, Brian. Then I told Peter, well, we'll clarify it. And then we tried to do that. And then Peter had to go on, luxurious vacation in Ireland or something. And I couldn't get a hold of him. So I decided, you know what, I'm just going to trust that he's going to show up today and he's going to say something really insightful. And because he's always working on things that I never know about until they're way down the tracks, and so, but he's always got his fingers on all sorts of interesting things. So my notes here says he's dangerously smart, and I like that phrase, and I wouldn't hate it if someone used that about me someday. So just putting that out there. All right. One of the things I asked him to cover, and one of the things he wisely said he really couldn't cover was how do we maintain a pace of innovation in agriculture in the region when federal money is drying up? And I know he's talented at finding other financial ways to make things happen. And so that's enough of a connection. So Peter, how's that for a weird introduction?
Perfect. Yeah, it helps me justify not completely departing from the title of my talk. So, but nice to see you all. My name is Peter Culp. I'm the managing partner of Culp & Kelly LLP. We're a water and natural resources law and policy firm based out of Phoenix. We also have a related consulting business called Blue Shift, which does science, finance, management, other kinds of consulting relevant to the intersection of water and climate in the West. And we operate our 2 firms basically together as a joint venture in an effort to build solutions at that intersection of water and climate. What I'm going to talk about, as Doug was sort of indicating, is really the problem of bringing resources to the ground. And I'm not going to talk about how to solve that problem. I'm just going to talk about one particular solution that we've been working on. But I think it comes from the recognition that the problems we have in this basin are going to be solved at the end of the day on the ground between water users, by the folks that are trying new things, by the folks that are carrying out the things we know that work. And there are a lot of great things happening at the ground level, and there are also a lot of challenges to carrying those things out. So I'm going to talk about a project that we've been involved with that's sort of relevant to the conversation about agriculture, although it's not all about agriculture, which is called Blue Commons. This is, as I'll talk about in a moment, a nonprofit blue bank, which is a sort of effort to test out a sort of new strategy for conservation finance, both conservation in both the sense of like how we conserve water and how we use it differently, as well as potentially in the ways that you can use it to do restoration and environmental conservation. and sustainability. Just as a little bit of background, this project was born out of some work that was generously supported by the Walton Family Foundation quite a long time back. It was called the Liquid Assets Project, which was an effort at the time to look at how investment might be used to create better environmental, social, economic, agricultural outcomes in the Colorado River Basin. And I'll just say, I mean, the concern that I think existed at the time, and I think frankly still exists, is that there was a lot of focus, specifically with regard to agriculture, on sort of what could be taken out. But there wasn't as much focus in some ways on how you put things back in and how do you return wealth to the ground? How do you sort of create value for people as well? And so that was an effort to essentially explore potential approaches to investment that could accomplish that. One of the big outcomes of that report, I think not too surprisingly, but which was focused a lot on sort of tackling the problem of the sort of private equity and other kinds of traditional investment that were trying to enter the water space, was to recognize that while there was a role for that sort of investment, there was a real need for a very different kind of investment, which was willing to take bigger risks, that wasn't seeking sort of extractive levels of return, but that was focused on how to return wealth to the ground. And it discovered a lot of project opportunities and sort of approaches that were being used that had the opportunity to pay for themselves over time, but that in and of themselves weren't going to be able to support sort of investment grade return the way that was being thought about. And so what was really needed was, in many cases, just low to no interest credit, like revolving debt and revolving funds that could sort of support these kinds of innovative projects and sort of help people take risks at the ground level. So it took quite a few years to get there, but ultimately we actually decided to help create that piece of infrastructure, and that led to the creation of Blue Commons. Importantly, to understand, this is in fact a nonprofit organization. It is a blue bank, is the way we're describing it, a sort of first of its kind, we believe, modeled though after a lot of other similar experiments that have happened in the renewable energy sector with green banks and other kinds of similar financial solutions, and many, many examples of revolving funds, state revolving funds, think along those lines. That nonprofit organization is effectively engaged in sort of three basic activities. Number one, it is trying to bring technical support and other kinds of resources upfront to the problem of how you get projects to the point where you could actually do something and pay for them. Secondly, it's trying to bring sort of a financing solution for all the stuff that's unfinanceable or very difficult to finance. So, you know, frequently there's public grant money available, but it is only going to pay for one thing, or it's going to come in too late. Or it might be a reimbursable grant. And so that means you got to have the cash up front. Where are you going to get that? It's trying to find the solution for those things with things like guaranteed grant match, revolving lines of credit, longer term financing that's supported by repayment streams. And then the third thing it's doing is in many cases trying to help the on-the-ground folk develop new revenue streams around the projects they're doing that can then help to aid repayment and sort of recovery and reuse of capital over time. The point of which being ultimately to try and create this sort of cycle where what you're trying to do is sort of accelerate the pace at which things can happen on the ground, to sort of scale the projects that are being built, and then to hopefully recycle and recover those investments over time so that they can be reinvested back into the ground, not for the benefit of Wall Street, but for the benefit of the communities and people who need those resources. So this geographic focus of this entity, which is important, is the Colorado River Basin. It's intentionally designed to be a watershed bank that's sort of focused around a specific geography. And I think I just want to emphasize really importantly, this is ultimately just a piece of infrastructure. It doesn't build projects. It doesn't necessarily even come up with the ideas for projects. What it tries to do is support and empower the people that carry that work out on the ground, whether those are NGOs, small communities, tribal governments, farmers and ranchers. And a lot of this, as we'll talk about, is relevant to agriculture. So this is the challenge that I think you will see replicated everywhere in different ways in the development of change and sort of project work on the ground, which is that there's frequently a fair amount of resource potentially available to do the construction part or the sort of actual implementation. But there's a lot of obstacles to cross before you get there and not a lot of resources for that. And for those places, we're looking for farmers and ranchers to kind of take a risk, make an investment that is probably going to be hard to do, particularly if you're dealing with relatively small margins in your business. It's looking to NGOs to solve those problems, but those NGOs are also needing money, and they're frequently doing that on a shoestring budget, particularly when you're dealing with watershed groups and other people that are closer to the ground. They're going to have trouble getting those resources. And so the idea basically is to try and solve for some of those obstacles at those earlier stages of development. And so what, in essence, Blue Commons is doing, or the bank is doing, is that it's sort of borrowing from the later stages of this process to help fund the earlier stages of this process. And importantly, it's also borrowing from the outcomes that we're ultimately hoping to see in these projects and making and sort of betting on the come that we're going to get there and sort of see the benefits that we're going to see. And by doing that, you can sort of shift money into things like just the simple project of finding places where a new solution might be feasible, or helping a farmer rancher understand what might be possible on their property who's invested in trying to do something different. It's bringing resources to the all-important problem of kind of bringing the stakeholders together, which is everyone in this room, I'm sure, is painfully familiar with, is like the hardest part of the conversation. It's sort of like the whole subject of what we're doing right now in the basin. How do we get together to collaborate? It tries to bring resources to that. Anyway, and even things like grant writing and sort of funding even the outcomes afterwards. How do we monitor what's going on? How do we maintain the investments that we've made? That happens, and there are very sort of different roles that are played by the bank at different phases of that. But again, it's sort of bringing resources, frequently helping consultants or partners like an NGO, a city, others sort of make the investments that are needed to kind of develop a project. It's helping the local partners kind of get through those early stages, and then hopefully then providing the financing solution that helps you get there. This is a horrible diagram, but this gives you a sense of kind of what these financings sort of look like. And I'm not going to belabor this, but effectively what the bank is doing is it's operating a set of revolving funds. Each fund has a sort of specific target, a problem that it is designed to solve, and a sort of set of solutions that it is available to provide financing to support. It's not everything and everything. It's focused because part of the goal here is to reduce the transaction costs of doing things. And you do that by repeating, rinse, repeat things you know how to do. But those funds then are composed of capital that are put together. And one of the functions that the bank has is to effectively stack different sources of money in a way that creates the revenues and the capital that are needed to finance a project. The Blue Commons started primarily working with grant capital. It's now evolving to begin using what's called program-related investment, which is effectively being able to borrow money from a foundation or another entity that is willing to take a sort of concessionary, as we call, investment return below market, and ultimately pay that back. And so some grant money to ensure that there's money that can be lost, because all grants are given with an expectation ultimately of a 100% loss. And that potentially allows then money to be paid back at a low interest rate. But by putting that capital together, we then have a fund. That fund can do things like provide a match guarantee. And so there are some examples of projects where a partner maybe only had to have, let's say, 30% cash match in hand the day they applied for the grant. It was a 60-day notice of funding opportunity. How much could they find in 60 days? Well, they managed to scrabble together enough that they could apply for a $160,000 grant. But they had a $2 million project. So the bank wrote basically a letter of credit saying, well, if you get the grant, you've got the money. And we'll figure out how to finance it when you get there. That allows them to apply for the grant, get the big grant, now you've got a big project. And actually, in that case, we were able to replace almost the entire guarantee even before the project even started being built. It's also then doing things like helping people use a reimbursable grant. Many organizations, whether they be a private sector business, a farmer, a rancher, a nonprofit organization, a tribal government, a small community, a city or town without a lot of resources, all of them are sort of facing a situation where a reimbursable grant is kind of a double-edged sword. Yeah, it's okay, it's nice money, but if I've got to carry the cost of a project for like 6 months while we wait for the federal government to go through an incredibly complicated process of getting reimbursement, and there maybe even isn't 100% certainty that we're going to get all that money paid back, that's a lot of uncertainty, a lot of cost to carry for a small organization. It makes it, certainly most of those grants are inaccessible to things like a watershed group where you've got a bunch of landowners working together to do something. They're not in a position to front hundreds of thousands of dollars in costs potentially, and nor are any of their members. And then finally, it's, as I was saying, sort of paying for the things that can't be paid for. So if you got a public grant, it's going to cover, 50% of your project cost. Well, what about the other 50%? So instead of cutting your project off and only doing the thing for which the public money is available, do the project that really needs to be built. And there's a financing solution that can make money available and ultimately recover that over time. And then what's happening at the same time is the bank is frequently able to develop what we're calling here a benefit monetization agreement, which is to look at the benefit this project is ultimately going to create in terms of a social environmental outcome, or infrequently here, water conservation or a water benefit. And of late, and certainly as a sort of initial foray into this, we've been quite successful working in partnership with the Bonneville Environmental Foundation, which has been instrumental in figuring out how to do this, to mobilize corporate ESG money, corporates that have made sometimes ill-advised and sometimes visionary no net water commitment where they're going to offset their water use. They're not quite sure how they're going to do that, or they have some other commitment they're trying to meet towards a goal. And we are able to sort of help to quantify that in an agreement. Those benefits sometimes come from the project. Sometimes they can be just developed independently of the project so that the project could finance something that's going to create maybe not many benefits, but there's a way to monetize some other benefits that are being created, turn that into a repayment stream. That repayment can then go back in to help support the repayment of the loan, which is typically provided to the folk on the ground at zero interest. And at risk in the sense that if at the end of the day it can't be paid back, oh well. But at least the project gets done. So, not there. So I'm just going to talk quickly about just a few of these that are relevant to agriculture in different ways. There's a few of the revolving funds that Blue Commons is now operating. It's got 4 successfully going. One called the Binational Water Conservation and Restoration Fund is working in Mexico, primarily with smallholder farmers and with Restauremos El Colorado, which is the Colorado River Delta Water Trust, to help support what are effectively a fairly large number of these sort of crop conversion and efficiency projects where smallholder farmers are looking to either put in infrastructure or, in this case, most of the time right now, look at different crops or figure out ways to use more marginal lands. And it's creating a mechanism to finance some of those things. And it's doing that by using the mechanisms that were established in Minute 319 and 323 to get water into the Mexican Water Reserve in Lake Mead. And as water can be conserved on those farms, that converts directly into storage in the Mexican Water Reserve. And we're able to help monetize the benefits of that right now, primarily with corporate ESG, to effectively help support the financing that is then needed to do the actual crop conversion or the work on the ground. And that's now deployed just in its first couple of years is closing in on about $3.5 million worth of financing, which isn't a huge number, but it's not nothing. And I think shows the promise. It is operating also what we're calling the Tribal Infrastructure and Restoration Fund, which we'll talk about just a little more in a minute, but is sort of focused on the issues of how can a tribal government help work to finance, particularly here now, agricultural infrastructure, on-farm improvements, and also restoration work that the tribe is seeking to carry out when access to commercial credit is frequently something that's not going to be easily available to a tribal government, nor is bonding or a lot of other more traditional, what we would think of sort of in like the sort of traditional municipal sector is the way you would pay for those sorts of things. And we'll talk about that in just a second, but one of the first local partner for that has been the Fort Yuma Quechan Indian Tribe, which has done some pretty cool initial financing that we'll talk about in a second. And again, that's looking to have deployed a fair amount of money over the coming months, and with a already closed financing from last year. And then there's another one called the Rebeaver Watershed Restoration Fund, which is working with landowners on the ground as well as nonprofits who are doing sort of ranch restoration on private ranch lands and also public ranch lands, particularly focused on things like wet meadow restoration, stream irrigation, helping to control fire risk, and things of that nature. That fund is primarily focused on providing that sort of revolving credit function to allow people to use reimbursable grant funding when it's available. And in this particular case, as an example of why sometimes this stuff is important, all of a sudden, a couple of really big projects that had already been financed and were ready to go and had all their grants suddenly found themselves frozen with a totally uncertain whether those grants were ultimately going to come through. As a result, 2 big projects that have been in planning for years were suddenly faced with a choice. Okay, well, we either contract for the guy with the excavator and the other sort of key people that we need to carry this project out right now, or they're gone because they're going to go build houses or something, right, for the summer. And then we're going to miss the whole season. And then the whole project's set back a year, which then means that the grants are not even going to be probably very usable because the timelines are going to be off and we're going to forfeit a whole bunch of money. So instead, the bank just guaranteed those costs. They hired those consultants, those engineering companies, those excavators, all that stuff, all the mission critical elements of those projects, kept them going. And then once the money worked itself through, now the project is still going when it otherwise might have failed. Anyway, so not a problem, not a solution for the problem of the absence or disappearance of federal funding, but a good one. So anyway, these things I think have been pretty successful, sort of initial partnerships, a lot of them focused on agriculture and really sort of helping to bring resources to the ground. Again, it's not huge numbers yet, but this year, through this year, I think we're looking at about $6.5 million worth of financing that's been provided, another $4 million in public money that's come in that's been enabled by that. And so, you know, it's a start, and it's a way to kind of get at that problem of innovation. So I just want to take advantage of the fact that here today we have Frank Venegas, who's the water technician for the Quechan tribe, who is actually involved in what I'm just describing here as Quechan Project 1, their first financing. I just wanted him to show you some pictures from that work, as well as Jay Weiner, who's the outside counsel to Quechan tribe, who actually helped put together the original financing documents that made it possible for the tribe to take what's ultimately now a reimbursable grant. So if I could, just invite them to come up. This is sort of Frank's story, not mine. So.
Hi, everyone. My name is Frank Venegas. I'm the water technician for the Quechan Indian tribe. And Brian was invited to the party. I'm crashing it. All right. So like Peter was saying, some of these projects, you know, you got to try to get the timing right. And one of these projects is really huge. And it took a lot of collaboration, the partnerships, getting the funding and getting the timing down right, just right to get the projects done. We have a seasonal following agreement with Metropolitan Water District that also helped us to get these projects done. As you can see in the upper left-hand corner, that's a diesel pump that's currently pumping out of the Colorado River. And we are at the bottom of the river. So where we're at, that area, I used to be able to swim in. Now I can only walk across. It's about waist deep and in some parts only knee deep. The other one on the right-hand corner, you can see the buildup. Now that pipe was one of the most crucial delivery systems. It was a 24-inch pipe with 4-inch buildup, so that reduced it by 8 inches. So our ditches weren't able to get the water there in the sufficient amount of time. We since replaced it with a 32-inch pipe, so we're getting the water deliveries in less amount of time. And what you've heard is that the evaporation happens in the water delivery system. It's not pushing the water out in the fields fast enough, but now with these improvements, it's helping. The picture in the bottom left-hand corner is a Mojave ditch, and you can see it's earthen. The picture to the right is the head of it, and that's the south end of it. When we took these, okay. Okay, and this is the lining project. Now you can see the earthen ditch was about 6 feet wide, and now you can see it's reduced the footprint down to 4 feet. And the lining project, it actually is a big collaboration with moving a lot of earth through it. Getting the timing just right was important to get it done. The seasonal following program we have is during the summer months. This year, since we're following, Bard Water District also entered a following program, so we're able to get this project. And like Peter said, the timing and the funding, if we didn't have that funding for this summer to do it, we'd have to wait and do it in consecutive summers for the next 2, 3, 4 years down the road. With help with the partnerships that we build with Blue Commons, Bonneville Environmental Foundation, we're able to get the funding for this and get this project done this year. Part of what we're doing is when we're conserving our water is trying to figure out what we're going to do with the water saved from that. One of the major pushes that you've heard from the Native American tribes and all tribes is our connection to the river. As you can see, this area is covered with invasive species. We can no longer collect the natural resources that we need to continue our traditional practices. So with the amount of water we save, we're able to use that water on the restoration effort, which in turn only use a fraction of the amount of water. We saved 800 acre-feet of water by doing the lining. When the restoration started taking place, I talked to our environmental protection office and I asked them how much acre-feet is he going to be using. He said 500. And I was like, 500 acre-feet? He said, no, 500 gallons. I was like, yeah, all right. Let's 2 more acreage. So then from there, it went from 20 to 56 acres of restoration effort.
That's it.
And those are some of the seedlings that we first started when we were planting. And this is one of the cottonwood canopies that we planted. And this is the resources that we're able to now collect and use for our tribal traditional practices. So thank you. Let Jake speak.
So Frank got to talk about the good stuff. And I'm here to sort of fill in the last piece of the puzzle, which is really how we were able to do this transaction, which to a large extent was really through the innovation that Peter brought to the table, the support of Bonneville Environmental. And also, of course, the leadership of the Kitsan tribe for being interested and open to doing something innovative and creative like this. And so I do want to recognize that we have Kitsan elected leadership here today. Tribal Council President Jonathan Coteen, Tribal Council members Zion White and Christabel Illingsworth. And it is through the leadership of this council and the prior councils. I've now worked through 5 Kitsan tribal councils, and the leadership's message has been consistent, which is to go forth and build partnerships and find creative solutions. Because although Kitsan has a Supreme Court injunction and very senior water rights, we also sit at the bottom of the river system. And it is vitally important for Kitsan to have a living river all the way down to the bottom of the system. And to do that, we can't afford to sit on the sidelines to be able to achieve outcomes like this. And so what the financing arrangement that Peter is talking about really adds value to us in I think 3 key ways that I want to highlight. One of which is that negotiating the transaction between the tribe and Blue Bank was a seamless process to some extent because we were really inventing this as we went along. We were able to take experiences that we had previously had to say, okay, we don't want this model and we don't want that model, and here's where we've gotten hung up before. What can we do to design an agreement that provides the security for the funders, that provides protection for the tribe, and that allows us to do this in a way that consumes the bare minimum of administrative resources? Because Frank is a rock star, but Frank is an army of one. And we do not have at this point in time the internal tribal capacity to spend huge amounts of time on the admin, on the compliance, on the grant application piece of things. And so we actually hit a point of saturation about 1.5 years ago where we had to stop applying for federal grants because we did not have the capacity to manage the grants we were getting. And so the Blue Bank model really helped with that, both in terms of the upfront transaction piece, and then in terms of really streamlining the compliance piece, which is that largely this is the compliance, which is that we demonstrate that we are in fact using these resources to do the projects on the ground, and that checks the compliance box without having to go through a 72-part, 120-page reporting form. That's a really helpful thing for a limited resource tribe. The third piece, and Peter touched on this through the slides, but I really want to highlight it because it also is one of the things that gave Kitsan sufficient comfort to be willing to take the plunge as elected leadership, who has to answer questions from tribal members about what are you doing with our water and what sort of financial obligations are you taking on, is that the renewable grant agreement that we negotiated, the money comes in to do the projects. The repayment is in water savings. And so when Frank talks about the amount of water being saved through these projects and the delta between what it is that we want to reinvest in more efficient irrigated agriculture and what it is we want to reinvest in restoration projects, that still leaves a gap of saved water. That is what it is that we document and report back, and that is how we repay the grant in water savings over a 10-year period. And so there is not tribal capital at risk, but there is in fact demonstrable, tangible return on investment. Because one of the things that this concept is so incredibly valuable about is that if all we are talking about is moving money around, that's a zero-sum game. It's the same issue we run into in some of the conversations we had this morning about water allocation on the river, which is that if all that we are doing is talking about how to reallocate the limited resource of water, that's a zero-sum game. But if we can find ways to broaden the currency, essentially, money, restoration work, sweat equity, water savings, that opens the door to so many more possibilities. And so I know for Kitsan, we are just really excited and appreciative to be involved in road testing some of these things that we really hope can be scalable because we've got plans for more of this, and we would really like to see this rolled out across the basin. So thank you for the opportunity, Peter.
Thanks, everybody. Appreciate the indulgence there, but it's a great story. So thanks so much.
This job's so easy. I just turn the mic on and smart people show up and say smart things. So thanks, Brian and Peter and Frank and Jay. All good stuff. We're going to go to questions. If we have questions that tie your two presentations together, I'll be impressed. But but Jason, you got this?
I'm present. So yeah, hopefully you're not suffering from the after lunch funk, but please upload your questions. Keep putting your questions in the queue. I do have at least 3 that I've been mulling over while y'all were talking that weave together the 2 presentations, but more content's always better. So grateful for anything you might put into the Slido queue. First question. Doug was dangerously smart, right, in putting Brian in a cage when presenting that data, right? It's like, hey, you talk about the data, be a scientist, yeah. But your liberators have arrived because the crowd wants to hear a bit more. And this is a question actually for both of you, if I may. Given the data on water use that Brian has shared, what are your respective thoughts on solving the Colorado River crisis? Where should water consumption reductions actually come from?
Well, after I sat down, I realized that I didn't make the one point that Doug asked me to make, which was when I was talking about the municipal, commercial, and industrial water as part of the overall pie, I mentioned that ag water consumption is 3 times the municipal, commercial, and industrial water. The point that I failed to make is that you can't resolve the overconsumption gap in the Colorado River system without investing or without a pretty large contribution from irrigated agriculture. And so you'd have to wipe out somewhere between 2/3 and 100% of the municipal water use in order to rebalance the water budget. So that obviously, Doug, sorry, I missed making that point. So obviously there has to be a pretty substantial contribution in water consumption or reduction in consumptive use in irrigated agriculture to make that happen. In the Great Salt Lake, the scenarios that we looked at included, and I think this is really important, but one of the scenarios was all in, meaning let's assume that municipal conservation can go another 20%. Let's assume that, different assumptions about making the point that it's very, very important, I think, that everybody is in this game. Everybody's got skin in this game. Everybody is contributing to the solution. So I think any solution has to have that kind of a hybrid mix. Rather than, so much we end up in these conversations where, the farmers aren't contributing enough or the cities are using too much water or whatever. So one of the options was kind of all in. The others did focus on the agricultural piece, and we looked at temporary fallowing, rotational fallowing, like is taking place on a grand scale in the Colorado River Basin. We looked at, instead of fallowing farmland, of leasing the water directly, paying farmers a price for the annual lease of some portion of their water supply. And we also looked at crop shifting. And I think to be a little bit more succinct, I think the agricultural water reduction is going to have to be somewhere between 10 and 20%. Just the ag part. The ag pie has to shrink by 10 to 20%. How do you do that in the least disruptive and fair and equitable and supportive way that you can? I think crop shifting is a really, really important part of that. I think there's some very big questions as to whether or not you can get all of it done with just crop shifting. We ran those analyses in another paper a couple of years ago for those of you interested. You can get an awful lot of water saved if you switch from, say, alfalfa or grass hay into more of a non-traditional crop. Bridgestone Tires is going to greatly expand their guayuli production as a rubber substitute in the Southwest. They've been doing experimental farms in Arizona. They're now moving into Texas and perhaps New Mexico. And they need a lot of land to do that. And that's a very, very low water consumption crop. There are other forage crops there's been some terrific experimentation. People like Perry Cabot in Western Colorado is doing a lot of work on what is a sufficiently similar from a protein or a nourishment standpoint alternative feed crop to just alfalfa and the traditional grass hays. But there are others. Sonoran white wheat, grown in the Sonoran Desert in Mexico for centuries. There's some farmers that are experimenting with that. If you just go from what we've been growing to something else that we've been growing, crop shifting potential is fairly modest. But if you do some portion of it being a fairly radical transformation into some of these other non-traditional, more alternative crops, then the potential goes way up in terms of the volume. So I think that's what I want to say. I'll end because this is probably the last time I'll speak here, because this one just draws the ire in the agricultural community, and it is permanent retiring of some portion of farmland. That conversation has moved pretty far along in the Central Valley of California. They're talking about taking 20% of ag production out of production permanently and taking it back to wildlife habitat, renewable energy production, things like that. I think it should be part of the equation. We ended up not including that as an option in our Great Salt Lake analysis because one of our co-authors was from a Utah university, and he warned us that we would set off a firestorm if we presented that as one possible option. But I'll say it here. I think it should be on the table as one portion of the mixture of things that could be done. And if you can do that in a smart way, meaning the least productive land that's still using the same amount of water as some of the most productive land on a per acre basis, if you can be smart about how you do that from a geographic prioritization, I think there's some potential there. Peter, I'm done.
Thanks, Brad. I'll try and be brief, but I mean, I think fundamentally, I guess the observation I would make is that I think we're right now locked in this basin in a somewhat unfortunate narrative, which posits, I think, at its core that somehow our cities and our farms are in opposition to each other. This is an agricultural versus urban fight, or an urban versus tribal fight, or a state versus, whatever. And I think, and I think if that's the way we characterize that, I think the water mass balance seems reasonably clear, and for better or worse, the economics is even a little more clear in terms of there's this huge amount of the economy that is not in agriculture. I mean, virtually all of it, right? Agriculture, that doesn't mean agriculture isn't fundamentally important, that the food and fiber isn't essential to life, that all of that is key to the survival of our civilization and doing that right, and that we've got to fix it in the face of climate change. But the reality is, 99% of the money is concentrated in the urban regions of this country, right? But at the same time, that's why this is a false choice, right? Because, I mean, I guess my observation would be, and I kind of said this a little bit in my remarks, most of our focus in terms of this conversation about water has been focused on what we can take out. There's very little conversation about what we can put back in. And I guess my observation as a practitioner would be, not to get too misty-eyed about the whole thing, but is that right now the hydrologic challenge that we face in this basin, if not everywhere else on Earth, is a mirror of the economic system that we've created, right? We have spent hundreds of years, but certainly the last 100 years, engaged in an extremely effective project of resource extraction and wealth extraction that has systematically moved wealth from the rural parts of this country, from more marginal communities, from agriculture, from tribal communities, you know, fill in the blank, and has moved it into a sort of a core. And that's how capitalism has worked, right? And even within that core, it's even further concentrated, right? So that now we've got a relatively small number of people, like 10 or something, that have like probably 50% of the national wealth. That's absurd, and it's obscene at some level. And the way we're gonna fix that is not through more extraction. We're gonna fix it by reversing the flow of capital in some way to make the investments back in the places we need them. And I think what I'm, I guess, feeling a little optimistic about in that sense is that I think, for better or worse, in the place we are now as a basin, we're getting to a place where we have highly integrated urban economies across an entire region. And each of those economies functioning as essentially a big regional economic hub where there's billions, if not trillions of dollars moving through those hubs. And those places can serve, you know, and are going to serve one way or the other as the hub of that economic activity. And we should be thinking about how we, I think, build the partnerships between urban and rural to kind of make those systematic investments that are going to be needed. And I think we're seeing those lack of investments are playing out in our political system right now. They're playing out in a host of other settings. They're playing out in a lot of metrics. You know, rural America isn't doing great, folks. You know, I'm from a farm community, and you know, and I left. So you know, there you go, right? So I mean, I think that's kind of the, to me, part of the answer to that question is, I mean, I think the answer fundamentally, yes, it's in agriculture fundamentally, because it has to be, because that's the mass balance and that's the economics. But, and so it doesn't make sense to make huge marginal investments in urban water conservation. We're spending thousands and thousands of dollars an acre foot. Not that we shouldn't do it, but like, but if we're going to spend $20,000 an acre foot to take out residential turf or something like that, why not make some investments in the communities where most of the water is right now, where folks are not doing great, right? You've got farmers in value chains where most of the wealth is being extracted by a downstream processor or a retailer or a wholesaler. You've got ranchers in value chains where probably 90+% of the money ends up in the hands of a meat packing industry because of concentration in the industry. That's a solvable problem, right? And I think the investment potential there is enormous if we can figure out how to work together across the.
All right, that economic perspective is a good segue for the next question. We have about 10 minutes left, so I want to burn through a few more. So Brian, as I recall, on your slides identifying the crops in ag to which most Colorado River water is diverted, alfalfa seemed to be number one, both upper basin and lower basin. And that's where this question kind of plugs in. We often hear about exports, right, of alfalfa, and they're thought of as exports of Colorado River water, right? So the question is, could you provide data on how much alfalfa that's grown with Colorado River water is used domestically versus exported? And perhaps as a follow-on or an add-on, how do you see those exports as relevant to the overall mass balance problem?
Well, this guy wrote a fantastic op-ed. Sorry. So in the Colorado River Basin, it's somewhere around 20%. And that number has been growing, particularly because of increased Chinese demand. And that's 20% isn't the finished product, that's the feed stock itself. So it was historically more Saudi Arabia and Japan were the biggest importers of our cattle feed crops, and China then sort of busted out of the chutes, and now we'll see what trade tariffs do to all of that, right? Oh boy. So that's in the ballpark. That gives you some idea. You know, again, what do I have to lose? So, you know, so there's another thing gets under my skin. This is for cocktail hour. I shouldn't be doing it now. Another thing that really gets under my skin is, you know, when we start to really sensationalize the use of water in the United States to produce crops that go to other countries, or we sensationalize other countries coming in and utilizing American farmland to produce crops that go back to their home countries. I think we need to be more careful about that conversation. Crops get traded all around the planet, and the United States is producing crops in other countries as well, by the way. And so, what I'm trying to say there is, let's be careful about that number. So 20% is getting exported out of the United States. It's part of our feeding the world is, you know, one justification for it. Another that Peter really pointed out, which I had never understood before, is part of the reason that the exports really jumped up is because somebody realized that we're importing all these other goods into the United States and we're sending those tanker transport ships back empty. And then they started to realize, well, you know, we could fill them with alfalfa and meet some of the demand for alfalfa in other countries. So it's, at the end of the day, I personally, I'm cautious about prohibitions or criticizing global trade. I think that we ought to be focusing that conversation more on how we want the water to be used, and also getting the water use back into balance, you know, so that we're not over consuming it, we're not over drafting.
Yeah, so alfalfa you can always get in a lot of trouble with, but I think, I mean, you know, at the end of the day, I guess what I'd say there is that I think one of the things we need to do, there's a lot of focus on alfalfa, and, you know, in many ways rightly so, because the cattle feed production is the single largest element of the water budget. And you know, and in terms of the returns in agriculture, it's also not the highest. Food crops, lettuce, all of this stuff is very high value agriculture. And the idea that we're going to balance a water budget on that is, you know, it's crazy. So, but that said, I do think that one of the things that's really fundamental is to focus on why alfalfa is important. And it's important, you know, obviously to the beef and dairy industries, and dairy in particular, increasingly important. And dairy isn't something you necessarily want to get rid of. You certainly don't want it to be more than a few hundred miles from your cities, because it, right? I mean, that's why it's all near cities, right? Because of the products that you're making, and those products have value, right? And everyone's using them. But it's also important, so, you know, and that's got to be thought about and dealt with as part of thinking about how you balance the water equation, because you can't balance it on the back of those industries. On the other hand, and the other way it's important is it's important for a lot of the folks that are farming, at least in my experience. And I'm not a farmer, so I'm not going to try and speak for it, but my observation and the folks that I've worked with is that one of the reasons that alfalfa is so important is, first of all, it doesn't require a lot of processing. So the processing is easy to distribute. It's easy to move around, although it's heavy and, you know, you can't move it huge distances. It's a cash crop. There's a lot of buyers for it. There's now this export market, which has helped to put prices well up, at least until very recently. And maybe most important of all, you can cut it multiple times, which means that it produces a regular payment of cash throughout the year, right? And that really matters in the farming business. And it's important for many of the folks that grow it. And it's important, I think, for many tribal governments that rely on farm-related income, because the 12 payments a year help substitute for, whether you're a farmer or anyone else, for, having a lot of free capital just sort of sitting around that allows you to carry a whole operation until you can get paid 12 months at the end of 12 months, or multiple years if you're talking about tree crops in many cases where you're long time to establish. So I think the way to approach those crops in my mind is to focus on why they're important from that economic standpoint, and then begin to develop solutions with that economics in mind, right? Because it's going to be a lot easier to convert to a different crop if there's, say, a facility that would allow you to like live through a whole year. We're on Bridgestone, you're talking about a couple of years between harvests for Waiuli. That's going to be hard to bear as someone who's got a cash dependent sort of business. So.
Okay. So I'm reconciling two things. I've got a question that has garnered 10 votes, which is a pretty critical mass. I got 3 minutes until folks go to afternoon break. What do you want me to do? Ask it quickly. Okay. Doug is dangerously smart, and he's putting you on a time budget, both of you. All right. So, and I think this one can be addressed pretty quickly. So Brian, spatially, your water counting diagrams broke the river system into 4 areas: Upper Basin, Lower Basin, Gila system, and Mexico, right? The question concerns your approach to the Gila Basin, which touches on things going all the way back to Colorado River Compact negotiations and the status of the Gila River system vis-a-vis the compact, right? So the question is, what theory are you using to include water use in the Gila River Basin as part of Colorado River use? Do you see Gila River Basin water use as necessarily needing to be accounted for based upon how the Gila River Basin is treated under the compact or other pieces of the law of the river?
That's a really tough one. So just to clarify, there's a lot of Colorado River water that's used in the Gila River sub-basin, okay? What we were trying to add is accounting for how water that originates in the Gila River Basin gets used. And again, we just thought that geographically it was important to take a look at the basin from its physical aspects rather than kind of ignoring it the way that, or not dealing with it directly the way that the Colorado River Compact did. It doesn't make a whole lot of difference in terms of outcomes when we talk about the whole overall imbalance of consumption with replenishment, because essentially all of the Gila River's water gets consumed within the Gila River Basin. There's very, very little that trickles out, the bottom end and contributes to the Colorado River. Yeah, so I guess my short answer is we did it more as wanting to look at the basin for what it is in reality, rather than as a political entity. Yeah.
Let's end the first half of our ag session here. Thank you, both of you gentlemen. That was excellent. You teed up a few questions that I know our speakers this afternoon are going to come back to. So that's awesome. All right, we have a break. We have a half-hour break. You know the routine by now. When you hear the cowbell, come running. All right, folks, take a seat, please. Pretty, please. Pretty, please. All right, we're going to get started. Whether you like it or not, we're going to get started. All right. All right, so a few of the talks, the last couple of talks, I think, set up a few questions that fit really well with our next group of presenters. So, and again, there's three different slices of what is a huge issue. So, you know, we'll give them some slack if they don't cover everything. But we're going to start with Daniel Mooney. Next, Dan Mooney, who's an associate professor of ag and resource economics at CSU. He's here primarily to talk about some efforts underway in the Upper Basin to reduce water associated with some ranching activities. With the caveat, I think this is the caveat, being that the only innovations that are going to actually work are to quote our good friend DJ Quick, if it don't make dollars, it don't make sense. So we're going to talk about things that we think work financially as well as work from a water saving standpoint. So I think that's all I got. Dan?
That works. Thank you. All right, thank you for the introduction. I'm glad to be here and appreciate the opportunity to speak to everyone. This is my first time at this conference as well. So great opportunity. I've been really impressed with the engagement and attention. It's been a long day and people are still really, you can tell how important this topic is and how invested everybody is. So as Doug mentioned, I'm an associate professor in agricultural and resource economics at CSU in Fort Collins. I have teaching, research, and outreach interests, and so this has been just a fantastic opportunity to see all the thought, being put to this really important topic. I mostly focus on agricultural production systems, food and agricultural value chains, and a little bit on the agricultural resource side. So thinking about things like water as input to agricultural production processes. And so I think based off the other presentations today, where I'm going to jump in is thinking about the coexistence of water conservation and cattle production. Can we work on both in some instances, in some contexts? So that's really what I want to address. The project that I'm going to talk about is a collaborative effort. And so I'm going to talk about 4 or 5 different aspects to this project, but as an economist, I kind of fit halfway through, right? And so there's a few other folks, Perry Cabot and Seth Mason, they're both here in the room and have been heavily involved with me on this work. And really, being as more boots on the ground even than I've been on this work. And then other engineers at CSU and economists, and then a couple of graduate students. So as part of the applied topics that I work on, the outreach, it's really nice to get students involved and think not only about the academic aspect, but the important topic-based things. So this is a conference on the Colorado River. I don't need to spend a lot of time on the motivation, why we're here, why I'm talking about this topic. What I do want to focus in on are these ongoing pilot programs and this interest in voluntary and temporary conservation practices, right? So that's where I'm going to zoom in a little bit here and talk more specifically. And then particularly about livestock. So oftentimes when we think about water accounting, we don't directly incorporate livestock operations. We look at the crops and the land use and what the associated water use is with those, but ranching operations are a source of local economic activity, source of livelihood. The ranchers run their operations as a business, and so we have to think about them staying liquid to pay bills, trying to grow their net worth and remaining solvent. So if we're going to get this coexistence of water conservation and cattle, we have to think about the way that these operations operate. And so the kind of a temporary fallow for a grass pasture based operation wouldn't work well because these are perennial pastures. Potentially if they're going to try to improve it one year, it might fit in to some type of cycle, but it's really hard to just do this on an annual basis, like just completely fallow and eliminate all evapotranspiration. So we really need some information on the feasibility of how well water conservation practices would work on a livestock, a working livestock pasture. So that's what we tried to dive into. Short term, we're trying to provide some decision support for people who might be thinking about doing this. And then long term, I think the type of work we're doing and the estimates we're getting could be useful in scaling those estimates up into larger water accounting type projects and data collection. So I'm going to talk about a specific study And what we did was we are trying to think about jointly sustaining livestock production and water conservation. And so that was the name of our project. We're thinking both about, system conservation in the Colorado River as well as the cattle production. So this is a follow-up as well from some of the previous presentations. I've got this table of consumptive use. This is limited to crop consumptive use. And so we're going to zoom in, not give the whole spectrum of all water use here. And then the first red circle that I have is grass pasture and alfalfa. So just two of these types of land cover, and then only for a certain elevation band. And so if we look at grass pasture and alfalfa combined, we get about 70% of crop consumptive use in the upper basin is associated with these two land types out of about 1.3 million. And this is a little bit dated now, the study, but it lines up pretty well with the numbers that we saw earlier. So what does that mean? So if you care about water conservation in the Colorado River Basin, you have to care about grass pasture and alfalfa, particularly at these mid-elevation levels. And then if you care about the grass pasture at these levels, you have to care about the livestock operations that operate right on top of those. So that gets to the importance. And then this is really the crux of the project that we're investigating. And so there's a lot of detail here, but I really just want to pause for a minute and let the information on this slide sink in. So we have different options about how we might implement voluntary irrigation withdrawal on a grass pasture. And we have to think about, kind of put ourselves in the shoes of an agricultural producer, think about their decision making, how would they cut back on some of that irrigation water? So this slide shows a few different options. I think looking at the very top row, we've got that full season irrigation withdrawal. That would just be not applying any irrigation at all. At the very bottom row, we've got the no irrigation withdrawal. So that would just be basically full irrigation as you normally would without taking into consideration any water conservation goals. And then in between there, you might have different options. So this one and done would be you just irrigate once in the spring, try to really fill up that soil profile with moisture. The pasture is going to use that stored water, over the season. It might start to deplete, at some point during the growing season. Then we might think about staggered shutoffs. So I think we've got June 1st, July 1st, August 1st. So you irrigate as normal. This would be called like split season irrigation. You irrigate as normal up until a particular date, and then you cease irrigation. As soon as you cease that irrigation, hopefully the soil water profile is pretty well built up, so you're going to have some carryover. It might last you a little while longer. Shoulder months is you irrigate once in spring and once in the fall. And so we'll talk a little bit more about winter grazing. That's an important part of pasture-based livestock operations, and so that fall irrigation potentially helps the pasture produce a little bit more forage and keep some of that stocking availability later in the season. Put it to bed wet is just irrigate once in the fall. So skip that spring irrigation and irrigate in the fall. So we've got a whole spectrum of different irrigation withdrawal practices that we're looking at and trying to think about how, which of these might be doable on a pasture-based livestock operation. I'm just going to point out here that in these, we've got these codes in the square brackets there. A couple slides, I'm going to use those. And so I can clarify that as we go, but we've got the full season irrigation withdrawal and the no irrigation withdrawal. So the NIW is our reference, really like our reference strategy. And so we'll try to interpret things relative to that, right? So as we use these other options to cut back, how do things look? So I mentioned that we have a big research team. We've got engineers, economists, some extension folks. We're working with ranch partners, with Western States Ranches. I forgot to mention that in the beginning. So this is the project that we're doing is a demonstration scale trial at Western States Ranches. So we're getting into working pastures on a ranch and actually implementing these practices that we list here at like a working scale, demonstration scale. So that's what we're trying to evaluate. All right, so as a multidisciplinary team, we're trying to approach this from different angles. So I'm an economist. I like to think about the economic angle, but I can't think about the economic angle if I don't know anything about the technical side of things. Like how well do those 8 practices actually, how much water could they actually conserve? What's the potential that they would have? Even if we know the technical potential, there are some challenges associated with actually implementing that on the ranch. So there's some timing issues, which I'll talk about. So there's some operational feasibility to combine with the technical and economic feasibility. And then there's like this behavioral feasibility. So some people, might not be interested at all, even if the economics make sense, right? And so there's like this willingness to participate angle. So we're trying to take a pretty holistic, systematic view of this and try to see what would it take to make some of these irrigation withdrawal practices, actually work on the ground. All right, so I heard a lot of conversation about cages and whether we should stay in the cage or leave the cage. I was debating whether I should put this slide in my talk. I'm glad I did, because I actually want to stay in my cage. So I've been in Colorado about 8 years. I'm pretty familiar with the water context, but I think the collective wisdom of this room, far exceeds my own knowledge. And so I want to be careful not to extrapolate, state what our results show. Our goal is to really focus on the field level. So there's a whole bunch of other wicked issues with water conservation, water shepherding. If we conserve water on one ranch and a different landowner picks up that water and grows crops with it, we don't necessarily conserve water at the basin level, right? And so we're going to sidestep those issues and just really focus at the field level. Could this work? And then we can think about these other issues later, some of the reservoir operations, regional, multi-state coordination. How would these practices actually get implemented? What are the legal aspects? We haven't considered those. This is also not a prescription for curtailment, so we're not really saying this is what should be implemented, how much water might be saved, and try to make normative judgments about is this the best way to do it versus other options. So I'm gonna stay on the field with the cows in this talk, but happy to entertain those ideas or questions later. All right, so what I want to do is get kind of dive into the details here. So we started with the technical feasibility. Is it even possible to conserve water with these voluntary withdrawal practices? So Perry Cabot, some graduate students, another colleague, Jose Chavez, worked on 2 pastures with Western States ranches, and actually did this in the real world, measured the water conservation, both from like an instrumentation perspective, like weather stations, but also like satellite-based remote sensing, ET, and one of the fields had this gated pipe irrigation, another had a side roll irrigation system, and that's how the treatments were implemented. This is the pasture at Banner Ranch, and so the horizontal lines are the different scenarios that we considered. And so here I use these acronyms. At the very top, where it says FSIW, that's full season irrigation withdrawal. So that's where you don't irrigate at all. The 1AD is one and done. And then the SO06, that's shut off in June, shut off in July, shut off in August. And so we're progressively checking those different strategies. So this was done in 2003, and we do, and each of the 6 figures are a different month. So it's the crop water use as of a different month. I think the dates were selected based off cloud cover, and there's a little bit of strategy and convenience there. And then the scales change a little bit, but you can tell how uniform the field is initially. And then over time, as those zones get more water stressed, you see a lot more red pop up with some of those treatments. And so we don't have time to do all the little comparisons that I would love to do for an hour and that we get to do as a group as we talk about these. But a couple things that we notice is that full season irrigation withdrawal and the put it to bed wet, where we just irrigate once in the fall, they pretty consistently display lower water consumption. And we do see some spikes after fall irrigations, and so it's pretty, the data is pretty robust to what we're seeing. So why are we doing all of that work? We're trying to get data that looks like this. So I've got 2 columns in red. I've got the no irrigation withdrawal, which is on the left, and then the full season irrigation withdrawal on the right. And so that's basically comparing the difference in conserved consumptive use, we're getting about 13.27. So if you don't irrigate at all on a grass pasture, you're going to save about 13 inches of water. But there's still grasses on that pasture, right? So there's still some crop water use, and that's what makes this project a little bit unique. On the horizontal axis, we've got the percentage reduction compared to the no irrigation withdrawal. So as we cut back more and more on water, we can see like the full season irrigation withdrawal conserves about 40% of the water relative to that no irrigation withdrawal. The put it to bed wet, which is in the fall, pretty similar. This turned out to be a little bit higher in this case. It's a demonstration scale plot 1 year, and so there's always a little bit of variability. But pretty promising results. So the one and done, the June 1st shut off, we do see quite a bit of water conservation without, fully shutting off irrigation for the whole season. So we want to look at these and compare those to the forage estimates. This is the other pasture at the Hart's Basin Ranch where we implemented the identical experiment. And so if you look horizontal at the figures, it's either consistently red or consistently green, which means we're getting pretty uniform results, like within a strategy. As you look horizontally, if it goes from red to green, that means like the field's just like a little bit more variable. There's more heterogeneity in the water use and soil types. And so we felt like the Banner example was a little bit more representative of like the uniformness. But between both studies, we do find that particularly as you shut off irrigation early in the season, you do get pretty significant water conservation savings. All right, so what? So we can conserve water on a working pasture. We need to know what's the trade-off with forage production. So how much less are we able to feed our livestock? So the second part looked at that aspect. So we're trying to evaluate the yield performance. So within the pastures, these demonstration pastures, and within each scenario, we had an enclosure that was protected from the livestock. So the livestock were actually grazing the pasture as this experiment was going on, and we had to keep them away from a small section. And so there were 10-foot by 10-foot exclosures, so it's a pretty small proportion overall of the field, but we're able to use that as kind of like a reference or a checkpoint and estimate what that forage production was without the grazing and compare that to the ET estimates. So, an important observation here, part of the reason that we're doing the study is that the field ET rates were non-zero. So there was ET on every field, even the full season irrigation withdrawal, still consume some water. The way that forage growth and production works is that there's some threshold that you need a certain amount of evapotranspiration before you get a measurable or like a consumable yield for livestock that they could actually graze. And so that contrasts a lot with like a full season fallow that you might do with an annual crop or an annual hay crop, where you can actually just, kill everything off, just make sure there's no evapotranspiration for that entire growing season. There's always going to be some here. And if it's low, but you don't produce a consumable yield, do you really gain anything, right? Because you're not getting any forage, you're conserving some water, but not as much as you would have if you would have just done an annual fallow. And so it's just another dimension of those trade-offs that we were looking at. We compared the field level data, so we got data points from each of those scenarios, from the enclosures. We were able to compare that to like a statistical model of crop, like a crop water production function for grass pasture, and things turned out really well. So I think Perry sampled the fields, the enclosures on July 18th, and the crop water production function would have told us we'd expect about 1.08 tons per acre, and we found 1.07 on Banner Ranch. So that one lined up really well. Then, the forage continues to grow, so there can be some regrowth after an initial harvest or after some initial grazing events. And so we're thinking there was about another 1 to 1.5 tons, depending on the location, after that first sampling, which was within the enclosure, which mimicked the grazing pattern of the cattle. So my very last bullet point here, I tried to include some numbers, but not all the numbers, because it's really hard to just talk through a whole entire table. But this very bottom point here, so that full season irrigation withdrawal still produced some forage through July, and it was about 56% lower. So we can use those as the bounds, right? And so there's different irrigation strategies. Some of them we irrigated longer, and we can use those values to determine these trade-offs. So that was the forage and water consumption pieces. And then this is where, my kind of background and interest comes in is what's the translational piece? So if we do the science and we collect the data in the field and we say, okay, we can conserve water, this is how much forage we're going to give up. What would it take for a ranch operation to actually implement this? What are the steps that they would need to go through? And I think this follows up on the previous presentation where it's like timing was everything, right? They talked about that. So that's what we learned with Western States Ranches. We worked with the ranch manager and tried to come up with like, what's some practical guidance? Like how would you respond to these irrigation withdrawals? What we did is we constructed an example grazing calendar. And we said, what are your grazing periods? When would the livestock be on these pastures? When would they move off? Where would they go when they're not on the pasture? And, what type of like adjustments would you do to that? What kind of forage supplementation would you need? You've got to purchase hay elsewhere or find other pasture to put your cattle on to make up for that foregone forage. There could be some yield drag, some carryover effect. So the second year after withdrawal, would you graze it as intensively, or would you still back off, right? If the pasture is a little bit fragile. So let me just jump ahead here to I think this is more interesting. So this is a lot of words, but this is the really interesting part of the storytelling. So this shows a lot about how this would actually be implemented. So I've got 4 rows. Each of the 4 rows is within a calendar year, what's the grazing period? So we took a calendar year, we broke it into 4 grazing periods. There's a really important spring grazing period that combines some of the standing forage from the previous year with new growth in the spring. That's actually really important for the weight gain of livestock as they go to graze it. And so if you're rotationally grazing, the cattle might graze it once or twice in April and May. Some point in June, you move the cattle off the pasture into other permits, which might be like Forest Service permits, some type of grazing permit on public land or another pasture that might be at a different elevation. And then there's no cattle from June through July and October, and that forage is regrowing. So sometimes they'll cut that for hay, but usually they'll leave it standing to bring the cattle back in winter and do winter grazing. And so if you're cutting off your irrigation midsummer, late summer, you're gonna have less standing forage and your winter stocking capacity on that pasture is gonna be a lot lower. And so it makes it really difficult for a livestock producer who has a cattle herd. It's hard to just liquidate that and not worry about that problem. They have to eat somewhere. And so that's really, I think this winter grazing period is where a lot of the adjustments and supplementation and things like that need to happen, but also in spring for that crossover period. So there's a lot of details there, but that's a little bit of the storytelling. Then we said, okay, if you would start to implement these voluntary withdrawal practices, how might that grazing calendar change? And try to think about what is the economic impact of that. So if you shut off your irrigation, say July 1, you're not going to have an impact on that spring crossover period in the year of withdrawal because you can irrigate as normal, right? But then as you get more restrictive on what you irrigate, those impacts might grow. We put together like ranges of what the impact would be, how many stocking days you might lose, and tried to put a economic value on those. So that was just our thought process, and I don't have all the details here, but I hope that approach is clear. So we took this operational aspect, the water savings, or I should say water conservation, and forage impacts, and we said, okay, what would it take from an economic or financial perspective in terms of compensation for that conserved water use to bring that pasture back up to equate with the no irrigation withdrawal setting. And so this is a picture, actually, I meant to highlight the pictures more because that's part of the cool aspect of this project, are these pictures. This is, basically showing the difference between these treatments. And I'd have to pick Perry's brain to remember exactly which one's which. But you can see there's a big difference, right? I grew up in the Midwest. If you ask a farmer to do something and their rows don't look straight, right, they say no, right? That's kind of like the classic story. What would it take to convince somebody to, let their pasture look like that one on the left, right? It might be a hard sell. All right, so what I did is I used a partial budgeting framework. And so we looked at just the net change in returns. So we're not saying this is how much you'd make from the pasture, just if you implement these practices, would that return go up or would it go down? So for example, if you're getting compensation or revenue from the water conservation payment, that's additional revenue. If you need to make up some hay supplementation, that's an increased cost. So we're putting these pieces together to try to see what that impact is. And then the other aspect I think that's unique about livestock operations that make this project different from like an annual crop or annual hay type setting is that these operations, they sell the cattle, right? They produce the hay to feed to the cattle. And so we have to be careful with how we value this foregone forage production, but there are some different options. And so I looked at 4 different pricing scenarios. So one is just let's say I would just rent out my pasture to somebody else. I might charge like a animal unit month basis, but I might not own the livestock in that case. It's potential that I could cut it as hay in just, like a hayed pasture, which is pretty, similar to like a annual hay field that you might annually fallow, but because it's perennial, you can't just completely eliminate all ET. That's the second case. And then the third one, I guess the fourth one is that reference case, kind of like assuming that this would be a annual hay field. That third one is really the key one to think about the coexistence of water conservation and livestock. So we can determine basically the foregone gain. So you could think of like so you either have a calf, right, that you're feeding and growing, or sometimes people purchase young cattle in the spring, put them out on pasture, sell them in the fall. So it could be pretty typical that like a steer calf could gain about 600 pounds per acre. So we could figure out, what's the value of that increase. If they start at 600 and you're trying to raise them up to like 1,200 pounds, they would consume about 14 pounds of dry matter per day. So we can determine the economic value of that reduced stocking capacity and put a dollar value on that. Before I go to the next slide, so I'll present a number, but really what we need to do here is show like a matrix of values, right? So we might have a different, those livestock prices are variable, the grazing cost is variable, how much gain you'd actually get is going to be different for each pasture. So we're going to present like a range of values in our final report. I'm just going to show one number because I want to emphasize a couple takeaways. And so this is just an illustration here. So the blue, that 33.7 that's circled, that's the consumptive use on the pasture under the reference no irrigation withdrawal. And then the lighter blue rows show the conserved consumptive use by implementing the irrigation withdrawal strategies. So we might only conserve between 7 and 39% of the water. But what does that translate to for reduced forage? 20 to 95%. And so the impact on the water use is smaller compared to the impact on the forage production. That's going to hold really important implications for the economic break-even analysis. A livestock gain equivalent, you could gain about 352 pounds, and you'd be giving up to 327 pounds of that gain. By implementing the strictest scenarios. So what does this all translate to into an economic value? Just for these kind of assumed values. I'll start at the far right, I think based off the way you all are looking at this. I've got the annual hay comparison of 149 per acre foot. So if you'd produce about 2 tons of hay, you'd take the revenue you get from that, subtract off the production cost, say what's my break-even value? It's about 150 per acre foot. That's right around where some of the initial regional water conservation prices started. But if you compare it to the full season irrigation withdrawal column, that's a lot lower, right? And so if you're just looking at it from that simple hay perspective, you're going to underestimate what that value of the forage is to the livestock producer. So I think it was, I can't remember exactly what year, but at some point the SCPP was paying about $5.09 per acre foot of water here in Colorado. And if we look at the livestock gain equivalent for a full season irrigation withdrawal, we're a little bit above that based off the assumed values that I put in there. And so it just shows that you actually, depending on how you value that forage, how you use it, you'd need to adjust your values and it's going to really impact your willingness to participate. As you shut off the irrigation earlier and earlier, you're getting some forage production, and so you're getting some revenue from the agricultural side of things and also a little bit of revenue from the water conservation, so that break-even price is a little bit lower. So I just want to wrap up with a couple slides here. I know we've got some other speakers. So the last piece of our puzzle that we looked at, and Seth Mason is here, who did some really nice survey work, is trying to think about what is the willingness of agricultural operations to engage with these irrigation withdrawal practices. So breaking even, like some of those values that I showed, isn't really sufficient. It's necessary, but maybe not sufficient to get somebody to actually implement these. And so, what else would it take? We know that people care about the type of program that it is. So what is the conservation action? Is it split season curtailment, full season withdrawal? What is the compensation level? And then some other aspects like an east slope match or this guarantee of water shepherding. Can we guarantee that the water gets to where it's supposed to go? Those are all factors that might influence this willingness to participate. So I just want to show a couple of graphs here to end things. So the axes are a little bit small. I apologize for that. But on the horizontal axis, we've got the basically like the expected participation. What's the probability that somebody might participate? On the vertical axis, we've got the compensation level. So you can think of this almost as like a supply curve, right? And so as you increase the compensation level, you'd expect more people to participate. The colors represent the different types of programs or types of practices that might be implemented. So the blue one is the full season curtailment, and that's the furthest to the left, which means that's what people are the least interested in. So they're more interested in like partial season or split season. And they would enroll more acres, or you get a higher participation rate for a given compensation level. The other couple of things we found, conserved acres matter. So people are more likely to enroll a small amount of acres, experiment with it, than they are to enroll all of the acres. And the east slope match has a big difference between those blue distributions. And so if people care about that east slope match, they're much more likely, or if that's part of the program, they're much more likely to participate. All right, so I think there's a lot of other information there. We'd be happy to talk about it more here later in the day. I just wanted to end with this comment that really, I think as a group and me personally with the outreach appointment combined with teaching and research, I'm really committed to this idea of science and engagement. It was a really high contact, multidisciplinary team that we worked with, which made this kind of the most that I've ever experienced before. Rather than us all working together, we learned a lot. I think we learned faster. We've got a lot of information to report out, and we're really in the early adoption phase. So if you're familiar with like the diffusion of innovations, we really need these demonstration trials, people willing to take risks and experiment to learn, hey, how can we get these things to work? How can we get more people to do it? What would it take? And so that's kind of my takeaway is this kind of optimism that we got to keep at it and come up with these practical guidance, and then we can get that coexistence to happen with the water conservation and the cattle. I'll stop there.
All right, thank you. Oh. And he's going to work her magic. All right, we're going to jump across the basin now to Arizona. A little different situation there. We're going to hear from Catherine Sorensen, who is the Director of Research at the Kyle Center, which is a water policy center at Arizona State University. Before that, she was Director of Phoenix Water Services. Phoenix is a town in Arizona. You may, small town. And in Arizona, I lived in Arizona 35 years ago. And in Arizona, the water issues and this competition, I was going to say between urban and rural, but it's a competition among everyone in Arizona for water supplies was a huge issue 35 years ago. Yeah, and it always will be, I guess. But there's some interesting things going on, and you're going to tell us about it.
I'm going to try.
All right.
Hi, thanks for including me. I was surprised to ever be asked back, so that's cool. Thank you. So let me start out by saying that if you want to understand the competition for scarce water supplies in Arizona, you really have to understand the framing. And that framing pertains to groundwater protection and Arizona's Assured Water Supply Program. Arizona does have large and productive aquifers, but those aquifers are filled with fossil groundwater, meaning that it is tens of thousands of years old. It is not annually renewed at any significant rate. And if you pump it out, you are behaving very irresponsibly towards future generations. So of course, we don't want to do that. And in Arizona, we put together, the fabled 1980 Groundwater Management Act, which is a regulatory framework that forces investment in renewable surface water supplies and in reclaimed water to avoid the depletion of groundwater supplies. And for context, we were already starting from a pretty big hole. Since this is an ag panel, I will say that from about the 1930s through the 1970s and even a little thereafter, there was a large amount of aquifer depletion, mostly, but not entirely, to grow crops. Mostly, but not entirely, cotton, other crops as well. But Central Arizona has long been a place of agriculture, and we were depleting our aquifers to grow those crops. And in fact, the Central Arizona Project, which of course imports Colorado River water from the main stem into Central Arizona, was viewed as an aquifer rescue plan at the time. So this frames competition. Nearly all urban development is prohibited from depleting those fossil groundwater supplies in the active management areas. And you can see in salmon, I guess that color is, you can see the active management areas. It is often pointed out that groundwater protection does not extend to the remainder of the state, but I think you need to remember that roughly a third of Arizona is tribal communities. They are sovereign, they are not subject to state laws. And another third is federal. So the AMAs do actually cover like 85% of Arizona's population. Okay, so who is allowed to rely solely on local groundwater? Who cannot? Ooh, that would have been bad. Who cannot rely solely on local groundwater supplies? And mostly that is cities and large private developments in those active management areas that need an assured water supply. And then there are also points of use with physical limitations, and meaning like, you're up against the aquifer, or there are other reasons why you can't physically access the groundwater. And I'll talk a little bit about those. So who can rely on local groundwater? Who's kind of off the hook if they so choose? Tribes, again, they are sovereign. They are not subject to the 1980 Groundwater Management Act. Farmers were grandfathered into the 1980 Groundwater Management Act alongside a few golf courses and other turf facilities like cemeteries that were there before the passage of the law. So they are allowed to continue to use groundwater. There are a few industrial developments that can pump fossil groundwater, but mostly industrial developments occur within the boundaries of municipal water providers that have an assured water supply. And so the municipal water provider is not allowed to deplete groundwater, and they serve the industrial customer. So that's usually how that works. And then, of course, as I mentioned, the law only really applies to the active management areas. So cities and towns outside of those AMAs can also rely on groundwater. Okay. Who's in the market for more water? Well, I mean, this is a long list, but honestly, it isn't everybody. I know you probably have that impression, but these are the people who are in the market for more water in Arizona. Cities and private water companies that need that assured water supply. The Central Arizona Groundwater Replenishment District, which is really just a department of the Central Arizona Water Conservation District, which is what operates the Central Arizona Project, so the CAP. The way that works is that some cities and private developments join this replenishment district, and then it is the responsibility of the replenishment district to go out and acquire supplies and replenish any fossil groundwater pumping that occurs. There are a few cities in this in the district. Most of the biggest cities are not. Phoenix is not, but it is an important mechanism for many. Flagstaff is just a good egg. Like, they are not subject to the 1980 Groundwater Management Act, but they've decided to voluntarily follow the rules of, for adequacy and for an assured water supply. And so they actually go out and try to acquire water. Tribes and towns that are negotiating water rights settlements often need water to facilitate those settlements. The Bureau of Reclamation needs water. They need water for a couple of different purposes in Arizona. One is that they have some obligations to tribes under existing settlements. And the other is that, of course, they would like to acquire water to build resiliency in Lake Mead for system conservation as well. There are some large industrial users who need to acquire additional water supplies. This would be, saw in this slide, a lot of people have questions about data centers, so let's just go there. Data centers often locate in the boundaries of municipal water providers with an assured water supply, but they're not always particularly favored as developments. They use a lot of energy, they use a lot of water, and they don't necessarily bring a lot of jobs. So often cities will say to them, fine, you can locate here, but you got to bring your own water. So they're often in the market. River restorationists, there are some people in Arizona who prefer to actually see water in our rivers, which is kind of weird, but sure. And then, of course, private speculators as well. So this is kind of, I don't know, I maybe forgot some people, but that's kind of who's in the market. Okay, what's the need? So of course, cities and developments need an assured water supply. But there is also sometimes a need to ensure direct deliveries to specific points. And I said earlier that while it is the case we have these aquifers, they're fossil, but there are places where groundwater is just not an option. And I want to give you a good example of that relates back to the Colorado River. When I was director at Phoenix Water Services, we started planning for Deadpool because we saw one of Eric Kuhn's slides and thought like, oh my goodness. So we started planning for Deadpool, and this was back about, oh gosh, almost 15 years ago now. And so of course I went to our engineers and said, okay, fine, let's just drill, I don't know, 100, 200, 6,000 wells, whatever it takes, right? Like just go out and drill some wells. We need to make sure that the portions of our service territory that are dependent on Colorado River water have a plan B, have a backup, and we'll be okay even if we hit Deadpool. So they run away, come back, I don't know, a few weeks later, and they say, man, I'm sorry, it won't work. I said, what do you mean it won't work? I don't even understand what you're saying. Well, it turns out that the portion of Phoenix's service territory that is dependent on Colorado River water, and it's about 40% of Phoenix's service territory. The other 60% is dependent on Salt and Verde River water. But of that 40%, there are portions of it where it's up against the boundaries of the aquifer. It becomes shallow and non-productive. And also, and probably more importantly, the hydraulics of the Phoenix water distribution system were just not built for that. The hydraulics of the Phoenix water distribution system were built for a few very large surface water treatment plants. And you have to size your distribution system pipes very specifically for a large source, right? And then if you want to change that and say, okay, instead of having one large source at a surface water treatment plant, we're now going to have, like 300 different sources, the hydraulics of the piping, they don't work. So Phoenix had to go out and spend about $500 million to build what they call the drought pipeline to be able to move Salt and Verde River water up into portions of its Colorado service territory. So, and to do that, Phoenix had to use some non-appropriative surface water supplies off that system. I can go into that at happy hour if you guys want me to. But that's an example of why it just sometimes doesn't work. Finding water for new settlements and meeting obligations under older ones. An example there, the Tohono O'odham Nation and the Gila River Indian community in their settlements agreed to accept some amount of the lowest priority Colorado River water available for long-term contract in central Arizona. It's called non-Indian agricultural water, NIA water, we call it. But as part of them accepting that lower priority water, they insisted that the federal government and the state kind of firm up some of that water, which means make it equivalent to higher priority water as part of the settlement. So there's a need for that. Mitigation for Colorado River shortages, that's the big one. That's a big need. And then again, we also want to leave water on the Colorado River as system conservation for collective resiliency, and some people want to restore those rivers. How big is that need? Man, I don't know. The shortage mitigation bucket is potentially the largest. The amount of water available amount of Colorado River water available for long-term contract in central Arizona is 1.415 million acre feet. I know many of you in this room, particularly those of you from the Upper Basin, are saying, well, we're not going to mitigate all of that. Fair. I will remind you that the Gila River Indian community has the largest allocation of the lowest priority water in central Arizona. And have you met Governor Lewis? He's a really persuasive guy. So I don't know what that mitigation looks like. It's probably big. The Lake Mead bucket. Okay, so yeah, probably we need a lot of water to help build some storage back into the system and build some collective resiliency. But that is not going to come all from Arizona. I mean, I'm pretty sure I heard Becky say that. So, we'll see how that goes. Okay, that got no laughs, which really makes me sad. Come on. Okay, and then there's an assured water supply bucket. And again, it's hard to say exactly how big this needs to be. Actually, the Kyle Center recently completed a paper on this. If you go to our website, you can go check it out. It's really hard to lay down concrete numbers, and these are kind of bookend numbers, I would say. And then for settlements and just all the other things, I just literally put a random number up here. 100,000 seemed like a nice round number. There's absolutely no reason for it. I know it's not zero. I know it's not a T-Rex. I don't know. Could be anything. So yeah, it's really hard to say how big the need is, but it's safe to say that it's substantial. Okay, so what's available? Depends on what you're willing to pay. And I'm gonna kind of put these in three buckets. You can go thrifting, you can go borrow from your sister's closet, or you can buy new designer stuff. In the thrifting bucket, I have conservation because it's always cheapest, right? But it's also kind of picked over. That's not to say there isn't more that we all can and should do. 100% there is. But let me give you an example. And before I do this, let me preface this by saying, I really hate it when the cities get up here and talk about all the conservation that they've done. And then, because it kind of implies, well, we've done more than you and you should do more and all that. That being said, I'm just going to perpetuate that. So bear with me. But it's for a reason. It's for a reason. I think this is a really great example of how conservation is a little bit picked over. Again, we can do more. There's more to do, but I want to put it in context. So this is a slide that shows percent of single-family homes with majority lush, grass landscaping in Phoenix. That back in the 70s, that was 80%. I remember that grass. I grew up on that grass. My father was too lazy to have grass. We had gravel, but across the street was a family that had immigrated from Greece, the Laladakis family, and they had the best grass in the whole neighborhood. And all the kids would gather there and play freeze tag. And I want to offer that after we've all had a few drinks at happy hour, we should all go play a big game of freeze tag on this beautiful Kentucky bluegrass. Not just because it's really fun to play, but also because at some point you too will realize that you live in an arid region and it won't be there. Okay, well that got you going. Okay, this is another example though of why it's cheapest, and I like this slide too. So this shows, and I'm sorry, the years got cut off. I think this starts like in the late 80s and goes to around 2020 or so. But this kind of shows the demands that the Phoenix water system had to meet in the hottest time of the year, our peak demands, and then the off-peak period. And you can see like it's just a downward trend. And not only is it a downward trend, but it's becoming less variable. And that's because Phoenix did something really smart in the 90s. Before my time, I can't take credit for it, but they started charging more for water in the summer. It is not illegal to have a lawn in Phoenix. You can still have one, but if you have one, it's gonna need a lot of water in the summer and you're gonna pay through the teeth for it. And what happens is people get that bill and they decide, you know what, I don't like grass that much. And so so conservation, really, really valuable tool. It's a great way to take the edge off of competition. It's a little picked over, but it's cheap. Okay, your next bucket is to beg and borrow from your sister's closet. And in this category, I put tribal leases and then the purchase of long-term storage credits. So I'll go through those. Okay, tribal leases. First of all, let me say the Kyle Center has also created an entitlements an access tool for Colorado River water in Central Arizona. It's a tool you can go in and see who has an entitlement to Colorado River water and then who is leasing and exchanging it back and forth. So it's kind of cool. But so some tribes lease out all of their water. Some tribes lease out some of their water. Some tribes don't have authority or to lease out their water. Some have authority and choose not to lease, okay? They are sovereign nations. It is their choice. Often they are reluctant to enter into long-term leases, which is understandable. But remember that in Central Arizona, the cities and private developments have to show a 100-year assured water supply. So to the extent those leases are offered for a smaller period of time, there's less value to the lessee because they need to show that full 100-year lease term. And they're also subject to, most of it is subject to shortage. There's a small amount that really isn't, but most of it is subject to shortage. So I call this kind of a small bucket for that reason, because it's possibly a large bucket in Lake Mead. And what we have seen over the last several years, and Governor Lewis talked about this, is that tribes have often preferred to be compensated for system conservation. And so while so the reluctance to hand out long-term leases, which creates some problems in Central Arizona for the people who want an assured water supply, it maybe does create this opportunity in Lake Mead that can be realized, which is kind of an interesting conflict between, creating individual resiliency at the local level and then collective resiliency for the whole system. The Colorado River Indian tribes have the largest allocation of the highest priority water in Arizona. And I'm sure you guys are all aware, they recently asked for and received congressional authorization to lease that, but have not decided to lease it. And I don't know what the future will bring. Okay, long-term storage credits. Okay, long-term storage credits can be created by recharging non-appropriative surface water or reclaimed water into aquifers. You get a credit, right? You put that water there, you put it in the bank, it's yours. They can also be created by delivering non-appropriative surface water or reclaimed water to farmers. This is an ag panel. The farmers use that water instead of pumping groundwater because remember, under the 1980 Groundwater Management Act, they were grandfathered and have the right to pump. So they use that water instead of pumping groundwater, and the water that's then saved, the groundwater that is saved becomes a long-term storage credit. And I know that the fact that Arizona stores water underground in our reservoirs irritates people in the upper basin. I hear that a lot, I hear you. But telling Central Arizona, which is lowest in priority on the Colorado River system in the lower basin, that it can't store water underground is like telling Denver Water or the city of Boulder that the only water you can store in your reservoirs is the exact amount that you need on the exact day you need it and not a drop more. And that's just not how responsible municipal water utilities operate. We store water because we need a buffer. Cities with an assured water supply use long-term storage credits to plug holes in that 100-year availability. So a lot of tribal leases that are in existence and that were for 100 years are no longer 100 years. Guess what? Like 30 years gone by. So those cities have to show that they can kind of backfill the remainder of that lease. So they're kind of hole fillers in that regard. CAGRID, the Central Arizona Groundwater Replenishment District, uses them to meet replenishment obligations. They are often pledged to those assured water supplies, and they are used as a last resort because to the extent a city with an assured water supply uses that credit, they have to replace it because they have to go in every 10 years and prove that they have an assured water supply. Okay. Some industrial users like them, like when a city tells a data center, no, you have to go out and bring your own water, they'll often try to purchase these long-term storage credits. Tribes create long-term storage credits and then sell them to others sometimes. Okay. All right, and then you can go buy new designer stuff. And who wouldn't want to look like that? And I'm going to break this down into two things, stuff that doesn't impact agriculture and stuff that does. Okay. Stuff that doesn't impact agriculture is to build new storage on the Verde. Leslie Myers from the Salt River Project is here. I'm sure she'd be happy to talk about that over a beer. Arizona is in the process of pursuing that. And desal. Oh yeah, desal. Okay, this is what I think of desal. Okay, it's like Lizzo's purse. It is the most beautiful, most exquisite, most expensive purse you can possibly imagine. But sadly, it only holds one Tic Tac. I love it. I love it. And I look forward to the day when you smart young people figure out a way for this purse to hold more than a Tic Tac. And I know that day is coming. I'm an optimist. Okay, stuff that does impact agriculture. Direct potable reuse. You might be going like, how the hell does that work? I'll tell you. Purchase and transfer, I gotta hurry, right? Okay, I'm hurrying. Purchase and transport of water from distant groundwater basins and by the farm. Okay, so ag to urban transfers, let me go there. I know my friends from California love to say, I hear it a lot, that Arizona just needs to do its own QSA. I get it. And I know the QSA, it was extraordinarily painful in California. Bill had a great example of how that was the case. But saying that does lack context of what has happened in Arizona and what is happening as well. So reclaimed water. So nearly all wastewater is reclaimed and reused in Central Arizona, nearly all of it. And a really large amount of it actually is used for non-food crop agriculture. The city of Phoenix, it is also used to recharge aquifers, and yes, there's a golf course or two. But the city of Phoenix is pursuing the direct potable reuse of reclaimed water. And as they move forward with that, that will mean less reclaimed water for agriculture. Okay, water farms. Under this scheme, you can pump from a distant rural groundwater basin. I think you guys do this in Colorado too, sometimes. I'm not really sure. But you pump from a distant basin, you bring it to your own basin. That's a transfer as well because, of course, often these rural basins are largely agricultural. Phoenix, Mesa, and Scottsdale had some, and they sold them. I was at both Mesa and Phoenix when they sold them, and if you buy me beer, I'll tell you the story. Flagstaff owns one, and private speculators own some. But probably most importantly, there's been a huge amount of development on agricultural land. And with all due respect to Ms. Limerick saying that people are just in the wrong place, it does show some misunderstanding of what has happened in central Arizona because land use is water use. And what you do with the land is what you do with the water. And one of the most water intensive things that you can do with the land is grow a crop on it. And so as central Arizona has converted from what was largely agricultural to largely urban, we have used less water. So it is where and how that development occurs is more important than how many people come. So if we're going to solve problems, we need to start thinking about it in those terms. Crops use on the order of 3 to 6 acre-feet per acre, depending on a host of factors. I have done the math. Kyle Center has a tool for this as well. Across the 3 active management areas in central Arizona, urban uses average 1.3 acre-feet per acre. So as we've urbanized on farmland, we have used less water. Okay, I'm going. We also, of course, sweep water off the main stem. The whole CAP contract is a contract in which whatever the agricultural interests in Western Arizona don't use gets swept into Central Arizona. I know it's not the QSA, but it is somewhat similar. And there were some permanent transfers as well that benefited the Auction Indian community and some cities in Central Arizona. Okay, the future of ag to urban transfers. I don't know, big maybe. I don't know what the Colorado River Indian tribes plan to do. Private equity probably, and that's already happening. You see private equity purchasing farms and for the purpose of someday selling that water. There's a very controversial transfer that involves the town of Queen Creek in this regard. I don't know what Yuma's going to do. I'm just going to say never. And there will be continued development on agricultural land as well. Okay. Oh, yeah. Okay. Water farms, yes. But in order to really effectuate this, we might need to think about building a new pipe and not just relying on the CAP canal because there are lawsuits and controversy about the quality of water that gets transported in the CAP canal. So this may entail building a different pipe. And yeah, why not? Let's drink some more of Vegas's water. Like, I don't know, it's fine. We're already doing it. That's fine. We've survived. Sorry, I'm trying to hurry. Okay, politics of water competition, nothing to see here. Everything's ducky. It's fine. And the cost. If you didn't buy it already, it's probably too late. But on the other hand, maybe it is like Bitcoin. Maybe, the price just keeps going up and you better buy now. I don't know. We'll see how that plays out. And I will stop there.
Okay.
You covered a lot of ground there. If there was one theme I pulled from that was that if anyone buys you beer, that you'll tell them interesting stories. Oh, okay. That was the theme, right? All right. Now as they say, oh, I need to get rid of this. How do I get rid of this? I don't know. All right. Now for something completely different, as they say. Many of the modern challenges associated with agriculture in the basin, are tied to the scale of the agriculture we have here. In many places, the industrial scale agriculture that by design shapes the region in many ways and creates many vulnerabilities. Before that was the norm, smaller scale ag, closely aligned with cultural values and nested in a philosophy of balance and sustainability was more the norm. And those themes, I believe, are evident in the work of the Flower Hill Institute, which is led by Roger Frawa of the Jimenez Pueblo in New Mexico, who is a long-term champion of tribal economic development balanced with cultural preservation. And until an hour ago, we hadn't met, so welcome, and I look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Good afternoon. I'm the last speaker. Good afternoon. I wanted to start off just by introducing myself as a 1,000-year-old farmer with an iPhone. And, when Brophy started off this morning with the invocation, which started this amazing day of amazing speakers and presenters and perspectives, PowerPoints. My wife said I cannot use PowerPoint. I have no power and I rarely make a point. It's true. No, I mean, it's true. She doesn't let me use PowerPoint. When Brophy started off this morning with the invocation and really talking about trust in our head and belief in our heart, if you listen to those words that started off this morning, and we think about that from your temple, your mosque, your synagogue, your church, your perspective, when you were a kid playing on the tag on the green lawn and, and all those things that shape us to where we are, walking backwards, and here we are, today, and we all share things as, children and young adults and whatnot. But when we think about those words about trust and belief, where we come from, was he born in a manger? Did he feed 1,000 people with 2 loaves of bread and 12 fish? Did he part the Red Sea? Could he walk on water? If you believe that, then believe this. If you can believe that, then you can believe this. We're all spiritual beings. All of us, no matter where you come from. And these chairs here are not empty. They're full. This room is full. Those that have gone on, those that are yet to come, the unborn that are coming, and no matter what race, creed, gender, orientation, background, economic class, city, state, tribe, no matter from where you come from, if you can believe that, then I'm asking you just for a few minutes then to believe this. That are spiritual beings, we sharing this human existence, and here we are today, all of us in this room. We're sharing a human existence, and here we are right now for just a few minutes, more. And the concepts of sharing and, doing something really, really difficult. And if you can understand and open up your cultural, spiritual aperture to understand that, in my understanding, that I wanted to share with you is that, we are spiritual beings and sharing this human existence. You said this was going to be different. That when we're talking about sharing this human existence, does water have memory? Those corn seeds, hopefully, that are being passed around that you're taking with you, put them in your front yard before you go in tonight. Just cover them with a little bit of soil, see what comes up. Those seeds have memory. Water has memory. So when I tell you I'm a 1,000-year-old farmer, I really believe that. I believe in my core when I'm in my field by myself at 5:30 and that sun's coming up and that golden sunlight hours, photographers call it, hits that irrigating water that's slowly creeping down. It's amazing. It's an amazing experience. And to know that, I'm just one, as insignificant as I am, and I promise you, my wife's not the only one that lets me know I'm insignificant, that, nature will let us know that we're insignificant in that sense, that we really have this responsibility as Pueblo men at the basic core. I mean, we can be lots of things, and many of us are other things. But at the basic core, we're farmers. Our emergence in the Four Corners, our migration from Mesa Verde to Chaco Canyon, the Greater Redondo Complex, and when Brophy and I sat at a very sacred place looking down on Redondo, just as our ancestors did thousands of years before, when they envisioned the Guadalupe and the Jemez coming together, they said, Walatoa, this is the place. Because they were already waffle gardening up on top of the mesa. And they said, we've got to move. I really appreciated Craig this morning and his perspective of just because they're not there doesn't mean they're gone. Doesn't mean they're not coming back. Doesn't mean that it's living. Doesn't mean that it's abandoned. Doesn't mean you can call it a ruin. Our migration, our emergence, and our migration through song, story, name, place name, still very active. And our kids in Toa, in Jemez, are learning that in a first language, real life sense, like daily. We just came out of the winter when we can tell our emergence, our migration, our stories in full sense, like we can really tell the whole story. And when you think about, as a simple Pueblo farmer, just trying to do the basic farming things. And sometimes, how proud I am to be just a simple Pueblo man, a simple Pueblo farmer, doing a very simple activity. But then and there, I really feel complete. I feel whole. I really feel like this is who I am, this is who I'm supposed to be. And it's taken me, 60 years or so to begin to really, truly understand who I am and how comfortable I am in my own skin. I've never been more clear in burying my grandfather, my uncle, burying my father. I've never been more clear of who I am, where I am, what I am, who I am. And it just feels so good, to finally come to a place where it's like, oh, okay, I get it, Grandma. And I'm telling my grandkids, I get it, and they too will get it, I hope, and maybe they don't now like I didn't then. But at some point, they're going to have that experience where I hope my son someday will say, I get it. Now I know what you've been talking about, Dad. I understand. So I'm supposed to talk to you about farming, but I wanted to talk to you about, with full transparency and authenticity, about where the farming talk comes from. Because a Pueblo farmer today, to be a good Pueblo farmer, you've got to be a biologist, botanist, hydrologist, an engineer, an equipment operator, a mechanic. You know, you've got to be a lot of things. And some people will drive by and say, there's a simple Indian out there working on his very simple field. But if you truly understand those Pueblo people and their emergence, migration, not so simple. It's a very complex place. It's a very complex existence. And I think maybe I would say this, I'm not sure it's to be true, that maybe it's even more complex than it has in the past. But I'm sure every generation felt that way and said that too. I think some of the complexity from my lived experience is that this year I've been planting and farming, you know, most of my life as a young child, and playing in the ditch, not really helping, probably causing more problems. Stealing fruit, breaking open a watermelon and eating that watermelon, and there's nothing that will ever taste like that, you know, on a hot day, having that cool fruit. And then as a young person, just trying to do the chores that my Uncle Jerry would ask me to do, and run and turn on the water with the wrench and walk the water down and doing those kinds of things. And then as a young adult and a teenager, trying to get through and just hurry, because I really wanted to go and be somewhere else and do something else. And then as a protector and a provider for my grandparents, my uncles, my aunts, my family, my children, and spent most of my adult life in that role, playing that part and doing those things. And then now, at my age and my experience and knowing, you know, again, bearing my grandfather, my father, my uncle, knowing that, you know, the majority of my life has already come, and I'm looking forward now to the rest of what I have, you know, with my children and grandchildren. But watching as the Jemez River runs dry in May, because it didn't get to the snowpack on Redondo this year, and having cultural discussions with my cultural leadership, having cultural discussions with my fellow farmers, and having, honestly, kind of a gentlemanly, but a debate. Don't you believe? Don't you have faith? Don't you have trust? Don't you run around with Brophy? You know? Because when you see that non-existent snowpack, and you know in the past that that snowpack used to come down all the way through June, maybe even into July, just in time for the monsoons. So your fields always had water. Your crops always had water. Not lately. Not always. It used to be that way. So when I think about, you know, kind of the complexities of being a simple farmer, and people drive by the field and they just wave and honk and you wave back, and you know that there's less of us farmers. We've had my grandfather's generation without a concrete ditch, without a Ford F-150, without a tractor, without a rototiller, without many people that were not my size. There were fewer, and they did way more. My grandfather's generation did 3 times the farming that we do now, 3 times. And there was less of them, and they were smaller. So now, you know, I'm trying. I am. It's hot, it's heavy, it's hard, but it's amazing. Again, when you're out there at 5:30 in the morning or 8:30 at night, and you experience that DNA of this human, this seed, that water, that soil, there's something that I hope that you will find in your life, that same kind of satisfaction and joy and experience in knowing who you are. Because it's much more than simply just farming or being just a simple farmer. For us, corn is not sustenance. It is. I mean, we do eat corn. We also wake up in the morning and pray with corn. We name our grandchildren with corn. We bury our people with corn. We communicate with these empty seats of those ancestors and those unborn through corn. Corn is an amazing healer. Corn has memory. Corn is living. So when I think about, what we're really trying to do, we're trying to grow more more food, more corn for more people with less water in different climate conditions. And we're trying to feed more people. Tribal populations are growing about 4% per year. People think, oh, not a big number. But when you compound that 4% over generations, we're doubling our populations every 20 and 30 years. We're the fastest sector of the US population by race, fastest growing by race. At one point in time, people called us the vanishing Indian, the vanishing American. 1 little, 2 little, 3 little Indians, 4 little, 5. How does the song end? No little Indian boys. I sang that song. I didn't even know what I was singing. I had no idea what I was saying. But the other kids were singing the song and I sang right with them. And when you think about those nursery rhymes that we were singing without even knowing what they meant or where they came from, the American Indian today, missing and murdered. I've seen on the list, I was listening very critically today about how Indian communities fit into the Colorado and wasn't at the top of the list always. It wasn't honoring the treaties first. It was somehow kind of melded into the mix of options. Flower Hill Institute is a Native origin not-for-profit. It was really initiated by Brophy Toledo as a challenge in a very sacred place at a very sacred time. And just simply saying, I don't want to talk about this anymore, the contemporary existence of the Indian communities and our youth and our communities, crime, drugs, people drive by, they come to our feast days and say, oh, what a beautiful place. Come on Tuesday night, see you on Thursday morning. Sometimes, they're bad neighborhoods if you took all the demographics and you said, what does that have to do with an urban area? I don't know, by demographic, maybe a lot. So Brophy was telling me, he said, I don't want to talk about this anymore unless we're going to do something. The next morning, I get up early anyway, but I called him around 5:30 and I said, hey, Brophy, Flower Hill Institute. He said, what's that? I said, well, that's our not-for-profit. He said, we don't have a not-for-profit. I said, not yet, we don't. That was 9 years ago. flowerhill.institute. You'll see in our impact report some of the things that Brophy has inspired and some of the work that we've been doing. We just continue to try. We used to celebrate getting a $1,500 check. Wow, somebody sent us $1,500. $15,000. Who's this? Where did this come from? $150,000. So we work hard, we try hard. We have an amazing board of director. Flower Hill and our ag program really is about soil restoration, water conservation. We've been practicing water conservation. People drive by the field, they say humate, they see cover crops, they say manure. You know, they see the 5 principles of soil health. You know, they see an irrigation system that looks different from everybody else's. But we're always experimenting, and we try to do something different every single year than we did the year before. And when we don't succeed, we learn. And really what we're trying to do, I can grow chili, I promise. I can grow chili, I can grow corn. I know how to do that. But I'm trying to grow experiences. I'm trying to grow our community's aptitude for accepting something different. Traditional Indian communities are very traditional Indian communities, and trying to do something different. Oftentimes, you know, it's not the easy path. But really, I just want my community to understand that we're going to have to do something different. Our emergence, Mesa Verde, Chaco Canyon, the Greater Redondo Complex, present day Walatoa. Can we pick up and move as we have before? We're going to bump right into Rio Rancho, Albuquerque. Not me, I'm going to Missouri. I'm going to go out west. You know, and Brophy and I have debated about this. When corn dies, we die. Yikes. Because look at the number of acres we're going. Look at the number of farmers we have. Is that true, Brophy, really? When corn dies, we die? Or do we remain to be what the Creator intended us to be, no matter where we live? Can me and my family move to Missouri and still be Pueblo? My ancestors picked up and walked and went to where the water was. Can I pick up and go to where the water is and still remain to be Hamas? Flower Hill's working on rewilding from an indigenous perspective, land stewardship principles and values. We're finding amazing partnerships and friends and people who have the same North Star that we have, the Nature Conservancy, the Turner, we call them the Turnerverse, the Turner Group and the Turnerverse. Amazing people, tribes coming together. So we're doing a number of different concepts and strategies, and we say indigenous led. We really value, appreciate tribal and respect tribal leadership. We follow our tribal leadership. This current political state that we're currently living in, I don't know, you know, where this goes. But I can tell you this, when I look in the future and I look at my grandchildren, I can say, we've been here before. Others, greater, stronger. They've tried to bury us without even recognizing that we're seeds. Right after COVID, and I think COVID was a really interesting instructor of the fragility of our tribal existence, our communities, our food systems, our economies. The first time we all had cabin fever, I went to a national conference that I swore I was going to not go to anymore, but I went just because I wanted to get out of my cabin fever. I went to Las Vegas to a national tribal conference, and there was this 80-year-old guy sitting there, and he didn't have the jewelry or the pottery or the rugs that you normally might see. He had Yupik art or Inuit art or something very different. So I sat down, I started visiting with this older gentleman. He had this like seal skin walrus tusk things. I said, "Oh, climate change central." He said, I said, no, Alaska, melting icebergs, rising sea, climate change, Because I said, no, not climate change. You're from Alaska. He said, "Oh, you people, I said, oh. I said, do you mind if I sit down? He said, sure, sit down. So I said, the icebergs aren't melting, the seas aren't rising, it's not getting warmer. I mean, that's not happening. He goes, that's not it. He's like 80 plus. When he was a little boy, imagine Barrow, Nome, way out there on the ice, just flat. The sun would sit in this crevice. He and his grandfather would sing the sun to sit in its cradle. They would sing the sun to sit and sleep. And he said the sun doesn't sit and sleep where it's supposed to. I said, oh shit. A much bigger problem than weather and season. It's a much bigger problem. And I started thinking about, why doesn't the sun sit where it's supposed to sit? And I started reflecting that night, and really taking a hard look in the mirror about the way I conduct myself in ceremony or not. And the way all of us in our synagogue, our church, our temple, and our grandfathers' teachings, how we're all not doing what they did anymore, or not as often, or not as earnest, or not in the same way. And then we all wonder, why isn't the sun sitting where it doesn't sit? So I think that those things do matter. And I think I'm in a place now where they matter more. I'm starting to realize my shortness, my shortcomings, my laziness, where I haven't done the things I should have done. And there's time. So I really appreciate the importance of ceremony and people and our leaders, not just Brophy, but many others from all various tribal communities. And all of us are Indigenous. 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 Don't put the burden on Indigenous people. You too are Indigenous. Your Braveheart tribes, your African tribes, your Asian tribes, your European tribes, we're all Indigenous. We all have to pick up and carry our own parts of those responsibilities, those ceremonies. Don't let politics get between you and your family at Thanksgiving. You know what I'm talking about. We're all laughing because it's true. It's never been more true today in the last few years than it's been the last few decades. There's something happening. That means we have to forgive. That means we have to compromise. That means we have to reach out. We have to be the bigger one. So I think about our youth, I think about our elders, and you. Maybe it's time for us all to do that. My last words I wanted to share with those Indigenous people in this room. We're the oldest. We're the adults. We're the oldest in this country. This is our country. That Colorado, that's our water. They're waiting. I don't mean just them. Them too. Those youth, the unborn, those elders. I sat at Chairman Birch's feet in the wisdom of Wendell Chino and many, many other tribal leaders who I was so fortunate to sit at their feet and to hear their whispers about how hard their life was and what they thought the future might look like. And here it's happening, what they were telling us, it's happening. So for you Indigenous people, especially my leaders in the room, with great respect, Chairman Tim from Hopi, Chairman Lewis from Gila, Quechan, the representatives, the young lawyers, you students, don't wait. There's not going to be a better time. Now is the time. This conference, these conversations need your leadership. They need your bold, audacious ideas. They need your leadership. They need you to stand up and move and say, we're going to go in this, we're going this direction. Let's go. It's time. And watch, people will follow. They're all waiting for your leadership. Don't wait. There's not going to be a better time. Don't do it for yourself. Don't do it for the tribe. Don't do it for this nation versus the other nation. Microbes, pollinators, winged, fin, four-legged, unborn, those elders. Now's the time. Lead. Lead. I'm a 1,000-year-old farmer. And there's others. I wanted to ask Daryl to come down just for a minute because he was foolish enough to invite me, and I probably will never get invited again. Daryl, not to embarrass you, but when I saw you walk in this morning, I thought, you are not dressed. So all of us be strong. Together, this is an amazing room. The intellect, the experience, the love, the compassion, the ability to put your ego aside, to make compromise. It's all here. It's all here. Don't go home without trying your best. Don't get in your car and go back to your respective four directions. Plan to solve the problem that needs to be solved. You can do it. I know you can. It just takes courage, and you have it. Thank you for letting me spend some time with you.
Thank you. That was fantastic. All right. This feels like a rapid transition, but it's time for our Q&A. Do we have some questions? Celine, are you doing this one? Okay, and we have some, if we have any questions that really integrate across all three presentations, then you also get a free beer at the reception at 5 o'clock along with Catherine. So yeah, if you have a good question, Celine, jump in.
I think Roger had the entire audience wrapped because we have not seen any questions come in since he started speaking. So it might take a minute for us to get some that integrate across the three. There were some follow-up questions for Dan and Catherine, and I'll start on those and watch the Slido. So for Catherine, the recent study published on water depletions in the Colorado River Basin shows significant groundwater depletions even in the AMAs. Why is this happening?
Yeah, so I am not super familiar with that study. I have not had time to read it. I saw, like many of you did, what came out in the press, and I don't know about the scale that was examined. There was another study that came out a little bit earlier this year. Actually, Brad and I were co-authors on that. It was out of the University of Texas, where they were showing that water levels in the Phoenix and Tucson AMAs had somewhat stabilized. So this is not my science, so I don't know, and I don't know about the scales. And I don't know which timeframes they were looking at, but here's the bigger picture. Yes, groundwater depletion continues to be a problem in Arizona broadly. And that what we have set up in central Arizona by storing some of these long-term storage credits is effectively intentionally created surplus underground. And like Bill Hazenkamp was saying earlier, you know, this creates this long-term debt that has to be paid off. And that's going to be a real challenge for us to figure out how to maintain aquifer levels and maintain that resiliency with the current scheme that we have. So we certainly have our challenges, but regardless of what that paper said, the achievements of the 1980 Groundwater Management Act are big. They are really big. We started with a huge deficit, like I said, mostly, not entirely caused by agricultural pumping, and we have managed to at least somewhat stabilize those aquifers. And that took a huge amount of discipline and money and resources and shouldn't be marginalized. However, yes, challenges remain.
Thanks, Dan. I'll move to one for you. Is it true that ranchers earn 5 to 10 cents on a dollar due to meat packing and other monopolies? Would breaking up monopolies make water conservation more affordable?
Sorry.
Thank you. So I'm not a livestock economist. So it's a little bit outside of my space. And I hesitate to comment on linking that to the potential for water conservation. I'm going to deflect a little bit and come back to, I just think this previous, the most recent talk here reminded us of why people do agriculture, right? And what agriculture means. And I think there was an earlier question about, land retirement, and I think that might be one tool in the toolkit, but it's hard to picture, all of agriculture, all of livestock production going away. And so maybe, at the margin, there's less of it. But I think it's going to persist, agriculture and cattle. And so I think it's how do we make it coexist? And so in economics, there's a term asset fixity. And it's if you have a warehouse, you could probably do different types of businesses with that same warehouse, right? And so that's, that asset might be flexible. I think with farming and ranching, there's a lot of fixity. It's hard to take, something like a grazing permit or, pasture land at high elevations and, just do something else, grow a different crop. The conditions might not allow for that. And so I think, there's always going to be external economic factors. So just to kind of come back to the question, there's always external factors and things that you might change and make something a little bit better, a little bit worse. Whether breaking up monopolies will, I don't think it's going to determine whether it's a viable option, right? This coexistence of grazing and water conservation. It might change the calculus or the break evens or the math behind that. But I think we need to find the solution and what's a practical way to implement that. And then we can think about, at the margin, what the effect of some of those policies might be. So sorry to not directly answer the question, but that's my thought.
Thank you. I think this one is for Roger. How do we bring an indigenous sense of reverence for nature to bear in a system of capitalism where creating wealth is the highest value?
I think that's a very easy question. Just don't do that. I'm not trying to be funny. I'm serious. We have to just stop doing that. Because as much as we participate in economies and economic systems, then we're all culpable. If we stop doing that, those seeds I gave you, plant those seeds. Donate your time. Work with farmers. I mean, it really is a very simple choice.
All right, Catherine, I think this one's for you. If Arizona has not adjudicated all of their water rights, how are cities and towns buying additional water rights, and where is the water coming from?
So over time, Arizona has found that trying to settle out water rights has been far more effective than trying to go through adjudications. So there have been a lot of settlements, and those settlements have opened up the possibility to exchange, lease, trade, switch water supplies among different participants within Central Arizona. So there's a lot of activity there. But the additional water supplies, so like I said, one of the big go-tos back in the day actually was to go out and buy a water farm, and Scottsdale, Mesa, Phoenix all did that. You basically buy land in someone else's groundwater basin with the plan to pump that water and then move it into your service territory. And those cities sold those farms for many reasons. But those are coming back, and you see private speculators now getting into that business. I will just tell you, the market is tough, and especially in the face of Colorado River shortages. So, Lizzo's purse might be what we have to turn to. It's going to be crazy expensive, but that's why I think it is really important to keep in mind that conservation is just always your cheapest option to go to, and that's what many of the cities fall back to first.
Dan, there's a question for you. You stated that alfalfa and grass accounted for 70% of crop water use in the upper basin, and Brian had stated it was at 90%. And why are those numbers different?
Yeah, great. Good question. So my 70% number was actually for a certain elevation range. I think it was like 5,000 to 9,000 feet. The upper basin has additional land in agriculture that's below 5,000 feet. A lot of that is in more heavily in annual crops. And so I think that would explain the discrepancy.
Thank you. I'm still looking through the questions. Feel free to add more as I'm doing this. Catherine, this one's for you. How does a data center bring their own water into the system?
Yeah, it's a good question. So what they do is they purchase those long-term storage credits that I was talking about. And basically, a long-term storage credit is, as I described, water that's been stored underground or saved because a farmer used non-appropriate surface water or reclaimed water instead of using groundwater. That is what most industrial users will go to when they're told to bring water. But that doesn't always work because, as I mentioned, there are sometimes just physical limitations in what wells can solve. And so it gets to be a little bit tricky. Some cities are not excited about bringing data centers, even if they bring their own long-term storage credit pump rights. So that gets really tricky. But data centers get a lot of press, and I get it. I'm not for or against them. I think that we have elected city council for the purpose of deciding what types of developments and industrial enterprise and other, zoning regulations best suit the needs of their community and whether those developments and enterprises are worth the water. And so I leave it to them to make those decisions based on what they think is best for their constituents. And in some communities, the tax revenue, the construction revenue, all those things are really, really meaningful. And to me, it's kind of, data centers are kind of like the next golf course, right? Like everyone likes to point fingers at golf courses. I get it. I don't golf. I don't care whether we have golf courses or not, but the people who work there do. And the people who, depend on that revenue and the sales tax do. And those are the kinds of local decisions that councils and stakeholders and the engaged public need to make. And those are tough trade-offs. But yeah, they buy long-term storage credits.
So this one's for Roger. The Hopi tribe has cultivated corn seeds for their drought tolerance over centuries. Can we reduce water demand by cultivating seeds that need less water?
Yeah, I think as they have done and they are doing. And I think the more, I think we're going to be forced to do that, first of all. I don't think we're going to have much of a choice, but to do that. And then those seeds, again, with their own memory, will start to condition themselves for more drought, kind of year after year. So I think that happens naturally. I think it can happen in an accelerated way through maybe science and other technologies and techniques. But yeah, I think the Hopi tribe is spot on. I mean, it's amazing in Hopi dryland farming, and they've been doing it forever. I mean, and that's why I say the solutions are in the room. There are solutions, and I think that if tribes are not just relegated to beads and feathers and some historic photograph, if they're brought into the contemporary and put into leadership position, I mean, why not? Those tribes have been very sustainable for a very, very long time. They truly understand sustainability. And where we're headed, we're probably going to need sustainability. Thinking, practice, acting, process. Why not a tribe or tribes lead? This is a good time to try.
I think this one was for Dan, but Roger, you may want to speak to it as well. Are there irrigation withdrawal studies using regenerative agricultural practices as it reduces irrigation needs and improves water retention?
I'll just go real quickly. In our field, we buried our pipes because the rest of our community has an irrigation system that's a little bit slower, earthen little channels. There's a lot that's lost through, evaporation. We buried our pipes, all in the spirit and the name of water conservation. So that's one of the things that we're experimenting with.
Yeah, thank you. Good question. So the topic of grass pastures, it's perennial, pasture, and so there's roots in the ground for quite a bit of the year. So another project that I'm working on on the western slope of Colorado is trying to encourage more no-till agriculture in furrow irrigated land. And so if you look at a map of the lower 48 states and what percent of cropland within each county is in no-till agriculture, in the Midwest, it's very heavy. And then as you go from, the Midwest west, as that precipitation drops off, so does the use of no-till agriculture. And there's a group of farmers who are experimenting with building their own equipment to create furrows that are permanent. And it keeps the roots in the ground for longer. They leave the soil covered. And just to tie this to the water conservation perspective, so that soil can hold the water better. And they say when the water leaves the field, kind of that tailwater that comes off the field, it's clear. It's not muddy. And so if you do conventional tillage, and you see the water leaving the field, it's carrying a lot of the soil with it. And so by incorporating those 5 regenerative principles, they actually graze the stalks, from the crops that they grow. It seems really impactful. And so they save on equipment costs, they save on, field passes. And so it's good for the climate. I think it has a ton of potential, kind of similar to this, the irrigation withdrawal practices. I think it's something that a few people are experimenting with, but that story's got to get out and, make it practical for more people to implement. So very interested in that topic.
All right, so this is for you, Dan. Richter asserted that the ag pie of water consumption has to shrink by 10 to 20%. Does your analysis suggest that this is a feasible approach to such cuts?
Yeah, so I would need to do some more back of the envelope calculations, I think, to try to understand, because a lot of the data that I see that's aggregated is, it's listed as alfalfa, hay. It's hard to know, I think the data I had was grass pasture. It's hard to know how much of, this is where I want to take this. So I think the ownership, basically the tenure or the ownership structure of the land matters, right? Because you can have grass pasture with different systems of ownership. So you could have somebody who's renting out the land, to a neighboring livestock producer. They might be willing to, okay, I can conserve water, right? Because I don't have a livestock herd that I'm trying to maintain. If you own the cattle and because your identity or your heritage is a livestock producer and you're trying to maintain that, I think it's harder. And so I think there's multiple layers, and we saw the drone imagery of the pastures, right? And so I think we need a whole bunch of other socioeconomic layers built on top of that to really try to understand what's possible. I think the participation rates might be higher for non-operator landowners, so folks who own the land but are no longer farming and are renting it out. I think they might be more likely to participate in the conservation program. So could we get 20% or 30% of those folks and only need 5% of the people who are managing livestock operations to participate? That might get us closer to that goal. But I think it's a microcosm of the larger conversation. I think it's going to be an effort of a whole bunch of different types of agriculture and practices that are all going to contribute and aggregate up to meet the goals, not just one type of practice that we can pick out and say, this is the one to do. Yeah.
So to the extent that we can achieve those savings in agriculture or frankly in any sector, I do think that one of the really big issues that we're facing on the Colorado River is that there is a need to build local resiliency, and there is also a need to leave water in the system. And that is a really important form of competition to pay attention to. I don't know how that's going to play out, but I think that's probably at the heart of the matter, because when you look at scale, like, yeah, Central Arizona needs a lot of additional water for all the reasons I showed you, but we also need to create a lot of storage and build Lake Mead and Lake Powell back up. And so I think that's just going to be a really critical and difficult issue.
Well, I think I'm going to hand it back to Doug and send you all to happy hour.
Is it upstairs, Chris? A reception that starts in 12 seconds, I think, and it's where you had lunch. And you're tired of hearing me talk, so go to reception and thank our panel first, but then go to reception.